Hello everyone, welcome back to History 2201, Ancient Greece and Rome. In this video, we're going to talk about Roman politics and the Roman emperors during the Pax Romana and then afterward. This video will cover the period from 27 BCE, when Augustus Caesar, or Octavian, becomes the first Roman emperor, and it's going to go till about the year 235 CE, when the crisis of the 200s begins. And the Pax Romana ends before the 235 crisis begins. The Pax Romana actually ends about the 180s CE, with the rule of Emperor Commodus, who was not a good Roman emperor. And during this discussion of Roman emperors, we're going to discuss whether these Roman emperors were bad or good. We'll look at their policies, how effective their policies were, how good their policies were. We'll look at their private lives as well. How well did they live up to the image of princeps, image of the first citizen that was created by Augustus Caesar? Did they model themselves after Augustus Caesar and seek good policies for the Roman Empire? Did they live a very sober, judicious private life, modeling themselves after Augustus Caesar? Or did they have bad policies that were unsustainable, that damaged the Roman Empire? Did they live a wild and crazy private life? Did they comport themselves to, or did they violate Roman social norms, sexual mores, gender norms, and things like that? And how well they live up to the memory of Augustus Caesar will determine whether they are a good or a bad emperor. Because many of these Roman emperors, while they might be considered good, as in effective, they were not necessarily moral or good people. Some of these Roman emperors, while very effective leaders, good emperors, they were very, very violent people. So this is how I use the terms good and bad. We will talk about the Roman dynasties, the Julio-Claudian dynasty from 27 BCE to 68 CE. It's actually during this period that the term Pax Romana will be developed. It will be developed about the year 55 CE by Seneca the Younger. Seneca the Younger was a Roman philosopher, and he was actually the tutor of the Emperor Nero, who is considered to be a bad emperor. And you'll see why Nero is considered to be a bad emperor later in this video. Then we'll discuss later Roman dynasties and later Roman emperors and their policies from 68 CE to 235 CE. And we're not going to talk about every single Roman emperor during this period, just some of the standouts, some of the best emperors, and then some of the worst emperors. And we'll talk about the Roman military during the Pax Romana as well. This Roman peace is a period of relative peace and stability for the Roman civilization, but there is still warfare. There are still military campaigns going on. And there are periods of infighting in the Roman civilization itself, although this infighting is not nearly as bad as it's going to be in later periods, like the crisis of the 200s. So it's a relatively peaceful period in Roman history. But the Pax Romana does not go until 235 CE. The Pax Romana, remember, it goes till about the 180s CE with the reign of Emperor Commodus, who was a bad Roman emperor. And in this video, we're going to use mostly documentary sources. There will be archaeological evidence used as well. This video is going to be setting the political stage for our discussion of the Roman Empire. Our next video is going to drill down into looking at everyday life, daily life for regular Roman people, and that video is going to use a lot more archaeological evidence. And the image on this slide is from a Roman bathhouse in what is now Algeria. That bathhouse was built in the year 70 CE. The Romans built their bathhouses using hot springs in many cases. This one was built on a hot spring. The water of this hot spring comes out of the ground at about 70 degrees Celsius, almost 160 degrees Fahrenheit, so very, very hot. It cools as it approaches the surface, cool enough that people can still swim in and use the baths. But the Romans also built their baths with artificial heating systems. They would build them with furnaces. So the Romans were skilled enough engineers to take advantage of natural heating from the earth, from hot springs, and then they could build artificial heating systems as well. And this bathhouse, which is still in operation today, uses basically natural heating from the earth. This diagram shows the 86 men that scholars recognize as being Roman emperors, starting with Augustus Caesar, whom we've talked about before, and ending with Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. And in this video, we're not going to talk about all 86 of these Roman emperors. We're only going into the 200s in this video. And we're not even going to talk about every single emperor in the 200s. As you can see, there are many emperors. We're just going to talk about some of the most famous, the most sort of standout Roman emperors during the time of Augustus all the way till about the early 200s. And as I said, we'll talk about the good emperors, and we'll talk about the bad emperors as well. This image shows what Roman emperors during the period that we're discussing in this video, what these Roman emperors might have looked like. This diagram was made by taking statues, material culture representing the Roman emperors, and overlaying colors onto these statues. Remember, these statues would have been painted, and they would have been painted to look like their subject, to look like the Roman emperor they're trying to portray. And scholars have found these colors based on doing studies of the statues, looking for remaining pigments that have faded with time. They also will look at documentary sources. They'll look at what Roman historians say about the appearance of Roman emperors, what hair color they had, what eye color they had, what skin tone they had, if there were any unusual marks on their skin. These Roman historians will note it in their text. And sometimes these Roman historians give differing accounts. One historian might say that Augustus Caesar had more like blonde hair. Another might say that Augustus Caesar had more like a light brown or chestnut color hair. So sometimes the historians disagree because they are not always contemporaries. In fact, many cases they're not contemporaries. They're writing decades after the people they're talking about have already died. So sometimes the documentary sources have different accounts. Also, sometimes words are translated differently from Latin. And so what you see is that scholars, art historians, archaeologists, historians don't always agree on what the Roman emperors specifically looked like, but they try to work together using material culture and then using various studies done on these statues, on these sculptures, and then using documentary sources to try to extrapolate or guess what some of these emperors might have looked like. And it's an interesting diagram as well. It shows Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, the first princeps, the first citizen. That was what the emperor, what his title was. He was supposed to be the first best citizen, the ultimate patron of the Roman people. He was not supposed to be a king, even though he really had the powers of a king. So you see Augustus Caesar here, who sets the tone for how a good emperor should behave, what a good emperor's policies will be, and some Roman emperors will do a very good job living up to Augustus's ideals. Emperors like Vespasian and Titus, I would say, were good emperors. Also, you have Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and then Marcus Aurelius, who are often referred to as the 5 good Roman emperors because they had good policies, and then they were 5 in a row. And we'll talk about some of their exploits as well. And then we'll also talk about the emperors that didn't live up to the Augustan ideal. We'll talk about people like Caligula, the Emperor Nero, and some of the things they were doing and how these actions, or the actions by these men, damaged the imperial office, the idea of the princeps, the idea of the principate, and we'll also talk about some of the later bad emperors as well. People like Commodus, for example, who, although he was the son of Marcus Aurelius, he was not a good leader like his father was. And we're going to talk about some of these emperors, these imperial dynasties, what they were doing, how they were affecting the Roman Empire. This video is going to be definitely more focused on sort of what we call high politics, political history. We'll be using artifacts and material culture to back up our documentary sources, but we're not going to be looking as much at daily life in the Roman Empire during this video. Our next video is going to be much more about everyday Romans and daily life, and it's going to lean a lot more on artifacts. This class is going to be a bit more political history focused, but it will provide some important background to understand daily life in the Roman civilization. And we'll begin by discussing the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And this is a reference to the first Roman emperors, Augustus Caesar, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. And Julio, of course, is a reference to Julius Caesar, who was the adoptive father of Octavian, who became Augustus Caesar, and then Claudian is a reference to Emperor Claudius. And contemporaries, as well as modern archaeologists, historians, generally think of Augustus Caesar as being the best emperor of this dynasty. And of course, I would argue that he's one of the best Roman emperors, period, and that good Roman emperors will study Augustus and they will pattern the way they rule and the way they live their life off of Augustus Caesar. But of course, Augustus Caesar was not perfect either, and we'll talk about his policies and his actions more later in this video. And Augustus Caesar, as the princeps, as the first citizen, he basically makes the principate, the office of the emperor, a monarchy in all but name. He has the power to overrule the Senate. He chooses his successor, but he doesn't want anyone to think he's a king. He knows that Romans, particularly upper-class Romans, senators especially, don't like kings. He remembers what happens to the Roman kings and how they're deposed and the republic is formed. So he wants to act as if he is not a king, but he's the chief patron. He's the first citizen. So he's not going to wear a crown. And although he's going to live certainly a wealthy man's lifestyle, he's not going to try to live that much better than the average elite Roman. And you'll see that in the material culture of his home, of his palace. And that's a problem, of course, with later emperors. A lot of the later emperors are a lot less concerned with cultivating the image of the first citizen, of being like Augustus. They're going to just basically live very extravagantly and not really care what other people will think of them. And that's going to be a problem for the Roman civilization. It's going to lead to a lot of strife, and it will even lead to civil wars. These bad emperors, they had violated their job of being the first citizen, of being the chief patron of the Roman people by being extravagant, by being decadent, by being corrupt. They were violating these sort of core Roman values of virtue and obligation by misbehaving, and just in some cases doing some really awful things, which we'll talk about. Speaking of awful things, on this slide we see a bust of Nero. He's the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and he's considered to be one of the worst Roman emperors by scholars. And this piece is interesting. Only this section here is original. The lighter marble is a 17th century restoration, but it gives sort of an idea of what Emperor Nero, what the original bust of Nero might have looked like. And there's a couple of other busts as well, and we'll talk a bit more about how Nero chose to represent himself, how he chose to show his image later in this video, and the significance of that. So we'll talk about Augustus Caesar's policies and the beginning of the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana gets going during Augustus Caesar's reign because by the time of Augustus Caesar's reign, Egypt has been subdued. The Romans control the entire Mediterranean basin. The Romans call the Mediterranean Sea Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea, And they thought of the Mediterranean Sea as not being a barrier, but rather it connected the various parts of the empire. The Mediterranean Sea connected Italia with other areas to the north and west, like Hispania and Gaul. It also connected the empire to the south, down to North Africa. Remember, Carthage is going to be rebuilt by the Romans because it's a very strategic, in a very strategic location. It also connects the Roman Empire to the Middle East as well. And the Romans built very good roads, but there's also going to be a lot of maritime trade and maritime shipping along the Mediterranean basin. And that allows for a lot of wealth in the Roman Empire. And what you'll see is that they have a very strong heartland that's united via the Mediterranean Sea, via Roman roads. There's a lot of prosperity, there's a lot of trade, and this will allow the Roman civilization to experience really a time of general peace. I mean, there are some civil wars, there is some internal strife, and there is fighting on the frontier as well. But during this period, it's not enough to destabilize the empire. I mean, there are some bad moments, certainly, like the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE during Augustus Caesar's reign, but generally it's a more peaceful time than in Roman history. It's certainly more peaceful than the last days of the Republic, where there were many civil wars, and it's certainly more peaceful than the crisis of the 200s, in which there's a lot of anarchy and chaos and other kinds of civil wars and problems. So it's generally a pretty good time to be a Roman. And Augustus Caesar, as emperor, as first citizen, he's going to focus on integrating his empire through the construction of roads, aqueducts, port cities. Some of these port cities, their construction began during Julius Caesar, but they're going to continue to be constructed and expanded during Augustus Caesar's reign to connect this empire together, to facilitate trade, and to facilitate his rule. He's also going to have things like censuses to count the Roman population for the purpose of taxation. Taxation is going to be an important part of funding the empire, funding these infrastructure improvements, funding the military. So things are going to be integrated during Augustus Caesar's reign. Carthage and Corinth, as I alluded before, are going to continue being rebuilt during this period. The construction had begun before Augustus Caesar's reign, but it's going to continue on. And these are going to become very important cities. Carthage, of course, is in North Africa, was destroyed by the Romans, but then was rebuilt. Corinth was in Greece. It's in a very strategic part of Greece where the Adriatic and the Aegean come together. Important trade city. It was also destroyed by the Romans, but then it was rebuilt because it was a very important connecting point between the Adriatic in the west and the Aegean in the east. And of course, there's trade by land via the Roman roads, and legions are going to be stationed throughout the empire, especially on the frontier, to basically ensure peace and keep order, and to keep barbarians from invading the empire. Augustus Caesar is also going to really finish the Marian reforms. He's going to continue the transformation of turning the Roman legions into a full, proper, professional standing army. And the army is going to have about 100,000 troops during Augustus Caesar's reign. Sometimes more troops will be brought in, also auxiliaries, part members of the Roman military that are not citizens and not legionaries. They're going to be brought in as well, but you'll see that it's a standing professional army being created by Augustus Caesar. Although the army during Augustus Caesar's reign is actually going to be smaller than it will be later on. And there's going to be some major social effects of having a larger military. There's also the Praetorian Guard system. The Praetorian Guards were basically Roman soldiers that were personal bodyguards for the Roman emperor, and they also guarded the city of Rome. And the term Praetorian comes from Praetorium, which is a reference to the tent that a Roman general would sleep in, and the guards that would guard his tent. So the idea of the Praetorian Guard is it's providing guards not only for the emperor, but for the city surrounding the emperor. And so Rome was experiencing what we would call good times during this period. There's a lot of economic growth. There's relative peace compared to other periods. But a lot of Romans were worried during this time of economic plenty because they thought that Romans were going to become soft, weak, and decadent and corrupt. Basically, the idea that weak times or good times create weak men. That old adage that gets used a lot. The Romans believed that, and so a lot of emperors, like Augustus Caesar, were concerned about that. Other Roman emperors, of course, were not really concerned about the state of the empire. They were much more concerned with their own selfish pursuits, which is not a good thing. But Augustus Caesar was definitely someone who was very concerned about the cultural direction the empire was going in. And to that end, he actually will favor things like censorship and suppression of ideas that he deemed to be a threat to Roman culture and Roman morality. He's going to have a poet named Ovid banished from the empire because he writes poems that that Augustus Caesar thinks are too risque and too inappropriate. Augustus Caesar will even have his own daughter, Julia, banished from the empire because she had sexual affairs outside of marriage, which men frequently had sexual affairs outside of marriage. It wasn't really looked down upon, but women were not supposed to have affairs outside of marriage, so he will have to actually basically banish his own daughter. And the image on this slide is of Augustus Caesar as the Pontifex Maximus, or high priest. Traditionally, the high priest or Pontifex Maximus is represented with a toga, but wearing a hood, I guess to show reverence, covering one's head before the presence of the gods. This piece is from the late Augustan period. Augustan-style architecture, or Augustan-style sculptures, technically, rather. They are patterned off of Augustus Caesar. They're a more idealized form of portraiture. They're not like the portraiture of the late Republic that displays people as they actually looked, with warts, double chins, etc. Instead, Augustan portraiture shows very idealized versions of people because Augustus was trying to cultivate his image. And some emperors will copy the Augustan style, others will not. Current figures like Mark Zuckerberg have looked up to Augustus Caesar, which is interesting, although a bit alarming. Zuckerberg, of course, being CEO of Facebook, or Meta as it's called today. For Zuckerberg to be interested in someone who was very in favor of censorship is a little bit alarming, but it just shows the appeal of Roman emperors and our classical past. People want to emulate people in the Greco-Roman civilizations, both for good reasons and bad reasons. As we continue our discussion of Augustus Caesar's reign, I should mention the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, 9 CE. I alluded to it before, but we'll unpack it a little bit more now. On September 9th, in the year 9, Germanic tribes led by Arminius attacked several Roman legions. Legion 17, Legion 18, Legion 19, and then their own auxiliaries. The legions were commanded by Varus, and they were attacked in a dense forest east of the Rhine River. The Rhine River had kind of been sort of the border between Gaul and Germania, or German territory. Gaul, of course, being a Roman province. Gaul was a Celtic region that was brought under control by Julius Caesar. Germania was Germanic territory, and some of the Germanic territory was part of the Roman Empire east of the Rhine. But the Germanic peoples, they rebelled against Rome for a variety of reasons, and they were led by Arminius, who had himself been in the Roman military and knew a lot of Roman tactics and strategy. Arminius is able to unite the disparate Germanic tribes. Like the Celtic peoples, the Germanic peoples were divided between various tribes and sort of clan groups, but they're able to come together to score a major victory against the Roman military, one of the worst defeats the Roman military will ever face. These legions are all but destroyed. Their eagles are captured, which is a very shameful thing for a Roman legion to endure, to have their eagle, the symbol of Rome, to be captured. And then any survivors that were found were sacrificed to Germanic gods, or they were sold into slavery. I will say, though, that the eagles were eventually recaptured. And Arminius had served in the Roman military. He'd even gained Roman citizenship. So he knew Roman tactics, he knew Roman culture, and that's one of the reasons that the Germanic people were able to defeat these legions. And it's the greatest disaster in Augustus Caesar's reign, in addition to being a major disaster in Roman military history. And this image is a modern reconstruction of a scene from the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. I'll explain how the battle went on the next slide. Here is the battle plan of the Teutoburg Forest. It's taking place in a very dense forest where visibility is low. That's going to be very disadvantageous for the Romans as they're marching into this territory, in hostile territory. Their auxiliaries and their cavalry are not going to be able to provide a lot of support in this heavy forested area. The Germanic tribes, they control the high ground, where they've built a series of fortifications and embankments to basically, they can hide behind and have some protection from Roman missiles like Pilla. It's of course not missiles in the modern sense, but ranged weapons like these javelins, the pilum that the Romans would use. Also, they're going to put things that are going to block the Roman legions that are traveling. Basically, the Roman troops have been funneled into a very small, very confining area. There's this high ground here where the Germanic tribes are, and then there's a swamp, which is going to be very difficult for them to move in. So in many ways, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. These legions are trapped in a very small area. They're facing an enemy that knows the ground better, and they're also facing an enemy that's led by Arminius, someone who knows Roman tactics and strategy, and it's going to be a disaster for the Roman military. When Augustus Caesar heard about the bad news of this battle, of the defeat of his legions, it was said that he wandered his home, his palace, shouting, "Varus, where are my legions? Varus, where are my legions?" He was so depressed and so bewildered and frustrated at this defeat that the Romans sustained. And this battle today is very important to German people. It's a sort of, you might even say, a proto-nationalist moment for the Germans. It was very popular during the unification of Germany as Germany is building an empire and a nation state for itself in the 1800s and early 1900s. And unfortunately, Germans in the 1930s and 1940s will also be very interested in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest as well. So it's another event from Greco-Roman history that is echoed through the ages. Here are some shots of the area where Teutoburg Forest, where the battle took place. It's a very heavily forested area, lots of trees, underbrush. It's very misty, especially in that sort of fall time of the year. This is happening in early September. This is a recreation of what some of the barriers the Germanic tribes would have built, what they would have looked like. It's basically an experimental archaeological reconstruction. Archaeologists and historians will often recreate buildings and material culture and artifacts from the past to understand how they would have been used in the past. So it's not a good place to not know the ground very well. It's not a good place for the Roman legions to be. And here is a Lorica segmentata pieces found at the battle site. And the soil at Teutoburg Forest is full of tannins. Tannins are basically broken down bits of leaves and plant matter. And tannins are very acidic, and they will really just wreak havoc on iron and metal. They'll also wreak havoc on human remains as well. We haven't found the kind of human remains you'd expect to find at a battle site at Teutoburg Forest. It's just the soil is so acidic it breaks down armor, it breaks down human bones. Although we have found some archaeological evidence of the Roman reports that said the Germanic people sacrificed Roman prisoners. That seems to actually be something that happened based on archaeological evidence. So this is some material culture from the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. So I mentioned Augustus Caesar's home, his palace, where he received the news of things like Teutoburg Forest, the defeat there. And I want to talk about his palace in Rome. It's called the Domus Augusti. the House of Augustus. And it's built on the Palatine Hill in Rome. It's a very large and expensive palace, but it's not that much more large and ostentatious than the home a wealthy Roman citizen, like a senator, would live in. Augustus Caesar, he doesn't want to seem like he's too out of touch. So he still has a nice house. He needs to have a nice palace. That way he can have senators over, entertain guests and things like that. He's an emperor, he's a diplomat. But it's not insanely ostentatious. It's not an insult to other wealthy Romans. It's a fancy domicile, but not too fancy. It's a fitting home for the first citizen or someone in the Principate. And this, of course, echoes the Roman tradition of patronage, where patrons would have large homes. That way they could entertain their clients. They could invite their clients over for meals, and the clients would ask for favors, and then the patrons would give orders to the clients and things like that. This is basically a larger version of that in Augustus Caesar's house in the Domus Augusti. It's also a lot smaller than later Roman emperors' palaces. It's smaller and it's nice, but it's not nearly as nice as some of the palaces that later Roman emperors are going to live in. They're not going to follow Augustus's example. Here are some interior shots of the Domus Augusti. You can see there are frescoes. You can see that the fresco, basically it's plaster and paint. Of course, frescoes, they are painted while the plaster is still wet. And then the plaster, it goes over stone and brick. The Romans would build things out of stone and brick. And they would either cover things with frescoes like this, or they would cover buildings with marble as well to make them more aesthetically appealing. So it's a nice palace, but it's not too nice. And here's a shot of the courtyard of Augustus Caesar's palace. It's set up like a bigger version of a Roman house. Roman houses would have had courtyards, a lot like Greek houses. This, of course, is just a bigger version. But as I said, it's not too big. It's not too ostentatious. And here is a close-up of a fresco from the Domus Augusti. You can see there's been some restoration work done to show what it would have looked like at the time that it was this building was being inhabited by Augustus Caesar. And these frescoes are very nice, but they're not too much nicer than what like a wealthy Roman citizen would have in his home. So Augustus Caesar knows that he can't live too much differently than just a wealthy Roman. He doesn't want to come off as too much like a king. And this is a plan of Augustus Caesar's house, what it would have looked like, as well as a reconstruction. It's in the nicest part of Rome, the Palatine Hill, where Romulus was said to have founded the original city. This is where later Roman emperors will live, and it's prime real estate, if we want to use modern terms. It's near the Temple of Apollo. You can see the various rooms of the palace. The courtyard, of course, can be seen as well. This is the Circus Maximus, the chariot racing arena. It's right next to Augustus Caesar's palace, which would make it easier for him to attend chariot races and other events there. So it's in a nice area, and you'll notice that later palaces are going to be a lot bigger, which is going to be a problem when you're trying to build in a very congested, very in-demand area in terms of real estate. And we'll talk about how other Romans respond to the lack of space in Rome later in this video. So this is sort of the palace complex in the Palatine Hill area. You can see Augustus Caesar's house. It's nice, but it's not nearly as big as later palaces built by like the Flavian dynasty or the Severan dynasty. So later Roman emperors over time are going to spend less and less time trying to live like Augustus Caesar. They're not even going to attempt to be a man of the people, a first citizen of the people. They're going to live much more extravagantly and opulently than Augustus Caesar did. And as I said, Augustus Caesar was not living like a peasant. He was living like a wealthy Roman, but he was not trying to lord over everyone as king. So his house is nice, but it's not too nice. So we've talked a little bit about the material culture, evidence, artifacts, sites that we have about Augustus Caesar, who he was as a person, how he tried to create an image for himself as the first citizen, the Augustan style of not being too ostentatious, not being too extravagant. We'll talk about some of the historians and documentary sources we have about Rome during this period. And we'll start by talking about Titus Livius, better known as Livy. He's a Roman historian, probably the most famous Roman historian. He lived from about the year 59 BCE to 17 CE, and he recorded a history of Rome during the monarchy and during the Republic. That work is called From the Founding of the City. It's his only surviving work. We believe he wrote other things, but they just have been lost to history. Livy was a friend of Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar wanted to support people like Livy. Livy was a historian investigating the history of Rome, but he's writing what is called a classicizing history. Livy is, from more the upper class. He's a wealthy man, and he's trying to tell a story that wealthy Romans, like Augustus Caesar, are going to like. It's a story that's going to appeal to more socially conservative Romans who want to look back at the struggles of Romans during the monarchy and during the Republic and are almost, in some ways, nostalgic for a more difficult time. And Livy's work is going to sort of highlight the bravery and courage of Romans in the past. And Augustus Caesar is really going to like Livy's work. So there is a bit of a bias, certainly, with a classicizing source. There's other types of classicizing sources. These sources are written by people like Livy, for example. They often have a bit of a bias to them, but in some ways, all works of history are going to have a bias. The author is going to bring his or her perspective in. But it's still a useful work. And Livy will use a variety of different sources. He'll use some mythological stories as well. And that's why, because of things like the classicizing bias, because of the use of mythology as a historical source, we use artifacts when they're available to try to get the most accurate picture possible. But Augustus Caesar regarded Livy very positively. Livy will be the tutor for his grandnephew, the future Emperor Claudius. And another thing that's interesting too about Livy's work is that it's written in Latin rather than Greek. Before this, Roman scholars would write in Greek because they thought of Greek as kind of being the language of education, the language of smart people. For many years in early modern Europe, for example, French was the language of smart people. That's where we get the term lingua franca from when you're using to refer to a standard language. So for many years, Greek had been the lingua franca. Now Latin is becoming the lingua franca as Rome is becoming an empire. Rome is becoming more, not just militarily powerful, but culturally powerful. And it's really a sign of a growing Latin-Roman intellectual tradition. And on this slide, we see an image of a Statue of Liberty from Vienna. Livy, of course, is going to be an inspiring figure to people far beyond the Roman Empire. He's an inspiring figure to historians, even if maybe there are some issues with his work. And this is a fragment from the founding of the city. Another author or scholar who's writing at the time of the Principate, the beginning of the Principate, the beginning of the Roman Empire, is Publius Virgilius Maro, or Virgil as he's better known. And he is a Roman poet. He lived from about 70 BCE to 19 BCE, and he writes the Aeneid, which we've talked about a little bit in previous videos. The Aeneid is a mythological, historical epic that traces the origins of the Roman people back to the ancient Trojans. Aeneas of Troy being a refugee from the city of Troy that was destroyed by the Greeks, who will go on to the Italian peninsula, and then his descendants will be Romulus and Remus. And of course, the story tells of the doomed love between Aeneas of Troy and Dido of Carthage. Of course, Carthage was not around at the time of the destruction of Troy. It would be built 400 years later. So it's not a very historical work, although Romans liked it and they liked to look back and imagine that this was their heritage, their past. And it contains a lot of mythological events like Aeneas going to the underworld. But it was definitely a very popular text with a lot of wealthier Romans, including Augustus Caesar. And it harkens back, again, like Livy's more historical work, a simpler and more honorable time in Roman history, something that Augustus Caesar, presiding over the Roman Empire, would have liked. A story like this is supposed to inspire the Roman people to be better, to be more disciplined, to be more hardworking, to be more virtuous. And so Augustus Caesar really liked the Aeneid. Scholars will debate, though, whether Virgil really liked Augustus Caesar or not. Some think that he probably liked Augustus Caesar because Augustus Caesar was bringing stability to the Roman Empire. Others argue that actually he may have disliked Augustus Caesar and that the Aeneid was meant to be a more subversive work that was criticizing the idea of having emperors. But either way, Augustus Caesar really liked this work, the Aeneid, and he had it preserved, even though on his deathbed, Virgil wanted to have it burned and be destroyed. He didn't think it was good enough. He wanted to work on it more, but Augustus Caesar said, well, I'm going to take this work and I'm going to preserve it anyway, even though you don't want me to. And basically, you could think of Livy as being a historian, even if maybe there's some issues with his work. For Virgil, you can think of him almost like a folklorist. He's developing a folklore for the Roman people, taking old stories that had already been around and putting them together as a single kind of epic poem. Basically, it's like a series of sort of tall tales that are going to inspire the Roman people. In America, we have tall tales about like Paul Bunyan and his ox Babe. We have tall tales about historical figures like Johnny Appleseed, who was a real person. We even have tall tales about historical figures like George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. With Virgil, he's trying to make basically a Roman version of these tall tales. Although, as I said, there are some historical issues, of course, with Virgil's work. Keep in mind, it's a tall tale. It's a folk tale for the Roman people. And the image on this slide is Virgil seated with his writing. He's seated between the two muses, Clio and Melpomene. Clio is actually meant to represent the muse of history, so this is not a historical work, but he's writing about the past. So he's shown next to Clio. And then Melpomene, of course, is a muse of the arts. You can see her holding a mask. And this is actually from Tunisia. It's from a little bit later. It's from the 3rd or 4th century, but it's illustrative of how Romans thought of Virgil. And this is Publius Ovidius Naso, or Ovid, sometimes called Ovid. And this author is not going to be liked by Augustus Caesar. By the way, Naso means nose. This is Ovid's cognomen. Probably started out as a nickname, but basically became his second last name. He lived from 43 BCE to about 17 or 18 CE. He wrote many works, but his most famous is the Metamorphoses, and it's 15 semi-compact but chronological books about the gods, humans, and it's about the divinity of the Caesar gens, the Caesar clan. And it's meant, in the end, showing the divinity of the Caesar clan to do homage to Augustus Caesar, claiming that he has divine ancestry. But on the whole, it's a more cynical and subversive work than Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil's Aeneid shows humans acting very nobly. It shows gods sometimes acting nobly. Gods and humans having missions and cosmic struggle. It's a very noble tale, but Virgil's Aeneid is not nearly as noble. It's much more cynical and subversive, I would say. The gods in the stories are very misbehaved. They cannot control their sexual urges. In some cases, there are cases of sexual violence told in the Metamorphoses. And of course, the Metamorphoses references how humans and animals are turned into different forms. These were famous stories from Greek mythology, and Ovid modifies them for a Roman audience. And it's also a very sexually explicit work as well. It does contain things like sexual violence. It contains descriptions of sexual relationships. And because of the way these stories work, the gods come off as being very dishonest, very capricious, and unable to control themselves. It shows lesser beings, like humans, being taken advantage of by the gods and being transformed by the gods and goddesses into other forms. And Augustus Caesar really didn't like Ovid's work. It does not fit with his plan to make Rome more moralistic, to prevent social decay. It really goes against everything that Augustus Caesar stands for. So he will have Ovid banished outside of the empire to Domus, Lower Scythia. It's in the Danube River Valley. By the way, Augustus Caesar also had his own daughter Julia banished as well for violating Roman sexual norms. Wealthier Romans, though, they read this work, and if they liked it, they would have wanted to keep that to themselves. They would not want to tell Augustus Caesar, well, I really liked Ovid's Metamorphoses. What you see is that during the Augustan period, even though there's a lot of peace and a lot of prosperity, because Augustus Caesar is so concerned about social decay and would even resort to basically censorship, wealthy Romans are too afraid to really challenge Augustus Caesar. The speeches of the late Republic, speeches like those of Cicero, which were very fiery and contained lots of invective and harsh language, that doesn't really happen in this period in Roman history, during the Augustan period. Wealthy Romans, they're going to keep it to themselves if they're reading Ovid. If they're going to make a speech, they're going to be very careful about the language they use. They're concerned that Augustus Caesar would be upset with the things they were saying if they're too over the line. It's a period where there's a lot of, you might say, social conservatism. Even as Augustus Caesar is making all of these new institutions, the office of the emperor is a new institution. Everyday Romans, though, they really enjoyed Ovid's Metamorphoses. They liked the stories. They weren't as concerned about offending the emperor. And actually, wealthier Romans' concern about offending Augustus Caesar, it kind of mirrors what happens with elite people in Hellenistic Greece, where they become a lot more concerned with upsetting whatever king or ruler is presiding over where they're living. So it kind of shows social stratification is increasing during this period. Even though there is peace, even though there is prosperity, there's concern about social decay and social decline, and of course there's social stratification. And the response to Ovid's work shows that even though there's a lot of good things happening during the Pax Romana, there's also a lot of concern as well. People are worried about social decline, but they're also worried about upsetting the emperor and getting into trouble, because it's a time where censorship is becoming more common. And the image on this slide is a bronze of Ovid. It's not from antiquity. It's at Domus, where he lived and spent his last days. And this is a fresco of Medea, a character in Ovid's Metamorphoses. She's a very prominent human character in the story. And this is a fresco from Herculaneum, which is near Pompeii. Augustus Caesar will die in the year 14 CE, and he will be interred in a mausoleum that's built outside of the city. The Romans, they did not like to bury the dead via inhumation, just putting their bodies in the ground. They preferred cremation, that is, burning the bodies of the dead. And then they would place the ashes of the deceased in these mausoleums. And these mausoleums, they could hold the ashes of multiple people. They basically were family tombs, a lot like what the Etruscans did. Remember, the Etruscans, even though the Romans didn't really like the Etruscans, there's a lot of elements of Etruscan culture in Roman culture. These mausoleums, they would contain what are called columbarium. They're little sort of niches that you would place the ashes of the dead into, a lot like a modern day crypt where ashes or the body of the deceased are sort of put into these niches in the wall, very similar to that. And columbarium, actually, the word comes from pigeon because they kind of are pigeonholes. Basically you're pigeonholing the ashes of the dead. But this mausoleum would have featured a similar but much grander architecture because it's built for the emperor. So Augustus Caesar's ashes and then those of later Romans are going to be put in the tomb. It's a family tomb from the Etruscan tradition. It was probably sacked actually by the Visigoths in 411 or 410 CE. Later it seems it was used as a theater as Roman monuments and things were falling into disrepair. The circular nature of the site would have probably given it good acoustics. And excavation and restoration of the site would begin in the 1930s. As I mentioned in a previous video, Benito Mussolini and his party in Italy were very interested in Roman history, and they wanted to uncover the Roman past. That way they could legitimize their rule in Italy and beyond. So this is an aerial shot of the mausoleum, and this is what it would have looked like in its original form. And this is the site of Augustus Caesar's mausoleum. You can see the restoration work that's been done on it over the years. Construction actually began before he had become emperor, but he was, of course, interred in 14 CE. And this is what it would have looked like before some of the more recent restoration work was done on it. As I said, initial restorations began as early as the 1930s, but they were doing things afterwards. So this is the mausoleum of Augustus Caesar. And you can see many features of Roman architecture. You can see the brick and the stone that are used. You can see arches. It's a circular building, but we'll talk about the mausoleum and its location on the next slide. This is the location of the mausoleum of Augustus. The Romans built their tombs outside of the city. Like the Greeks, they believed that decomposition and the dead were unclean, that they could make the world of the living, the land of the living, impure. So they generally build their tombs inside cities. When they burned bodies, they usually burned these bodies outside of the city limits, outside of the walls. They didn't want the ashes to corrupt the city of the living. In fact, it was actually kind of unusual that they burned Julius Caesar's body in Rome itself and not outside of the city. This was probably done to make everyday Romans want to rise up against the Romans that killed Julius Caesar. But Augustus Caesar follows the custom of having his tomb outside the city. They often did build their tombs alongside major roads, so even though you didn't want to have your tomb in the city, you built it along a major road. That way, as people walked by on the road, they could see your tomb and they could see how much money you'd put into your tomb, how extravagant your tomb was. Of course, over time, the city of Rome will expand, and Augustus Caesar's tomb will then eventually be inside Rome because Rome has grown. And they'll have to build more tombs and things on the other side of the Tiber River outside the city. And this is Augustus Caesar's Altar of Peace, which commemorates his military victories. It was probably built sometime between the year 13 BCE and 9 CE, but it's meant to show Augustus Caesar not just as an emperor, but as a successful general, as an imperator, showing not only his political power, but his military power as well. And it's made of marble that's been carved, and it would have commemorated victories like, for example, his victory over Antony and Cleopatra, which allowed him to become emperor. And having an altar like this showing his victories would also help to minimize defeats like the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Make people remember victories but forget about defeats. This is all about Augustus Caesar crafting an image for himself as the first Roman emperor. Augustus Caesar will craft an image for himself not just by having altars built, having tombs built for himself. He'll also have other buildings that are just for everyday Romans be built, and he'll make other kind of changes to the city of Rome. It was said that he found Rome a city of brick, but left it a city of marble. And this is, of course, reference to Roman architecture. The Romans would build buildings out of brick, and then they would cover them with marble to make them look nicer. And marble, of course, is very expensive. Cheaper buildings would be built from brick, and maybe they would put some plaster over the brick. But a nicer building, a more expensive building, would be built with brick, and then it would be covered with marble. So these building projects are showing that Augustus Caesar is benevolent to the people, and that he is making the city of Rome look better, look nicer. He's also going to begin Rome's first building codes. These building codes regulated how buildings were built in Rome, because buildings frequently would collapse and fall down and cause other buildings to fall down, and people would die when these buildings collapsed. A lot of these buildings could actually be pretty dangerous, especially the buildings that poor Romans lived in. We'll talk about their accommodations in their daily life more in the next video, but Augustus Caesar was concerned about the buildings of Rome. He wanted them to look better, and he wanted them to be safer. So he invests in the buildings of Rome. He creates building codes. He also creates Rome's first fire department, and that's to help prevent fires. Although there's going to be some pretty big and terrible fires that are going to happen even after the founding of the first Roman fire department. But fires would have been much more common in ancient Rome because people are cooking with, cooking fires, and a lot of the building materials are very combustible. He builds the altar of peace, or has it built for himself. He makes renovations to Rome's Forum, where Roman politics take place, including things like the Theater of Marcellus. Investing in entertainment for the people makes him popular. Julius Caesar, his adopted father and predecessor, did the same thing, and Augustus is going to follow in Julius Caesar's footsteps, showing himself to be a man of the people, who cares for the people and takes care of them, basically as the chief citizen, but the chief patron. And a lot of these buildings are going to be built using architectural principles from Vitruvius. This is Vitruvius here. He was a Roman engineer who studied Greek architecture. The Romans really liked Greek architecture, and they made some changes and modifications to sort of suit Greek architecture for their own culture. Vitruvius wrote a book called De Architectura, or Of Architecture, and he described the old Greek styles that we talked about in this class, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, but he also talked about what's called the composite order, which is actually a mix of the Ionic style and the Corinthian style. Some debate whether composite should be considered its own order of architecture, or if it's really just a mix of two Greek forms of architecture. Either way, Vitruvius is helping to modify Greek architecture and make it more Roman. And we'll talk about the composite order. I'll show some examples in future slides. And Vitruvius will also write about some uniquely Roman architectural achievements. True arches that are not corbelled. Corbel arches just have bricks that are sort of stacked up like pyramids. A true arch, the bricks are like a half circle. And so true arches are very important to the Romans. Roman aqueducts have true arches. And you need to be able to build true arches if you're going to build domes. And the Romans love to build buildings with domes. There's many examples, which I'll show a little bit more later in this video. And of course, the Roman invention of concrete. We'll talk about Roman concrete and how it's different from modern concrete later in the video. And he'll, as I said, build on Greek technologies to make larger aqueducts, heating systems, Archimedes screws, things of this nature. The Greeks had built aqueducts, and they'd built heating systems, but the Romans were going to basically take the Greek architecture and they're going to make it bigger. They're going to make it more ostentatious. So they're going to learn from the Greeks, but they're going to modify Greek architecture as well. And a very famous Roman architect, in addition to Vitruvius, is Marcus Agrippa. He was a general of Augustus Caesar, and he's also going to design a lot of buildings and build things for Augustus Caesar. And here are some images of some things talked about in Vitruvius's work. We have the Tuscan order, which is similar to the Doric order, but even plainer and simpler. The Etruscans liked the Tuscan order. Then, of course, we have the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders, which we talked about in previous videos. This is the composite order. As you can see, it contains the volutes of the Ionic order, but it also contains the very intricate carvings of the Corinthian order. And it's put together as a composite. That's why it's called the composite order. And you can see the composite order on many different Roman buildings, Roman architecture. And the composite order is going to become one of the favorite architectural orders, one of the favorite column styles for the Romans. They're going to use it on like triumphal arches, for example. You can see these composite style columns. This is from the Arch of Titus, which was built about the year 81 CE. And what makes the composite order interesting is that it's decorated on all sides. It's got the Ionic style volutes, but then it also has these carvings. So there's always something that you're looking at, something beautiful to see with the composite order. Sometimes the composite order is also called the Italic order as well, a reference to the Roman origins on the Italian peninsula. Arches and domes are also very important to the Romans. Arches are, of course, aesthetically pleasing. These are true arches, not corbel arches. But they bear weight, so they have an architectural function as well. But the building of these true arches will allow for the building of much larger domes. So you have Roman architectural engineering knowledge, and you combine that with Roman concrete, and the Romans are going to be able to build some of the largest domes in antiquity. This is the dome, or part of the dome of the Pantheon. You can see arches, the arch of a sort of a small miniature dome here, because as I said, a dome is really just a series of arches, and then you see the large dome of the Pantheon. And the Pantheon's dome is decorated with these insets. These insets are called coffers. So Romans had a good understanding of the physics that's necessary to make buildings, but they also artistically they were very good at decorating their buildings as well. This is a bathhouse, bathhouse of Mercury near Naples. It's one of the largest domes in a bathhouse. So once again, it gives an example of what how frequently these domes were built in the Roman civilization. This is some more shots of the Pantheon of Rome, and it's a temple built to all the Roman gods and goddesses. And initially the Pantheon was built during the reign of Augustus Caesar by Marcus Agrippa, but I will say that it was destroyed by a fire, and what we're looking at today is actually a rebuilt version that was built during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, about the year 126 CE. And this is the largest concrete Roman dome. And you can really see how impressive of a building it is in terms of, it's a marvel of engineering, but also very artistic as well. And the building was so beautiful that it was used as a Christian church after the Roman Empire moved away from paganism. This is the facade of the Pantheon. It features Marcus Agrippa's name. I think it's pretty likely that when Hadrian and his architects were rebuilding the Pantheon, they probably tried to make it look at least something like what Agrippa's Pantheon had looked like. They even keep his name, but you can see the columns, certainly, the decorations. They lack fluting, but they have very intricately designed coffers. So it's a very beautiful building, certainly. And you can see the automobile here parked near the foundation of the building. That gives you an idea of the size of the Pantheon. What an incredible feat of engineering it was. The Romans built this building. So how were the Romans able to build such complex domes and such large buildings? Well, they had concrete, and Roman concrete was a little bit different than modern concrete. They used volcanic ash as well as bits of sand and lime and bits of rock. And basically the volcanic ash, we think, was a lot like a naturally occurring cement. in order to make cement, modern cement, which is called Portland cement, you have to basically subject limestone or lime rock to very high heat. And volcanoes would have done this naturally. And they would mix this concrete up using rocks, sand, volcanic stuff coming from volcanic sources. And it's a very strong concrete. It's particularly good against saltwater corrosion. There's always a debate about whether Roman concrete was better than modern concrete. In some ways it was, because it could hold up to saltwater corrosion a lot better than modern concrete can. But of course, the Roman recipe for concrete is lost, and what we would call true artificial concrete using Portland cement, that's not going to really be made again until about the mid-1800s. So basically the Romans had concrete that allowed them to build the incredible buildings that they built, but then the recipe is lost, and then a new version of concrete using Portland cement is going to be made much later in the early modern period. On this slide, I'll give a summary of the Julio-Claudian emperors after Augustus, and then on subsequent slides, we'll dig into some of these emperors in a bit more detail, discussing their lives, what the documentary sources have to say about their exploits, and then we'll get into what archaeological evidence we have as well. The first emperor after Augustus was Tiberius, who reigned from 14 to 37 CE. He was the adopted son of Augustus. He was a good general, but generally fairly harsh as an emperor, and not as effective or loved of a leader as Augustus Caesar was. And Augustus Caesar begins the tradition of emperors having adopted sons be their heirs, rather than having their biological sons be their heirs. Although there were some biological sons that became emperors. And of course, in this system, empresses, wives of emperors, they don't become successors. They are consorts. They don't have real political power. They work behind the scenes, but they cannot become an emperor if their husband dies. After Tiberius comes Germanicus, better known as Caligula, which was his nickname. He reigns from 37 to 41 CE. He was the nephew of Tiberius. He will be adopted by Tiberius and will become the next Roman emperor. And Caligula, his nickname comes from little boots, or sort of little military-style sandals that he wore as a child. He had a good start as an emperor, but he really goes off the rails very quickly and becomes very violent, very erratic. He was accused of deviating from Roman sexual norms and living a very extravagant lifestyle, and some scholars think that Caligula may have had mental issues that caused him to behave in the way he did. But he's going to be assassinated by the Praetorian Guards in the Senate, and he will be replaced by Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54. Claudius is the first emperor to be born outside of Italy. He will oversee the conquest of Britain and the establishment of a 300-year-long Roman presence in Britain. Claudius will have his enemies assassinated, and he's certainly a better emperor than Caligula was, probably about as good of an emperor as Tiberius, maybe a little bit better because he does bring in this territory in Britain, or Britannia, into the empire. But Claudius is going to be poisoned, and he will be replaced by Nero, who was his adopted son / stepson. And there's some interesting circumstances around Claudius's death, why he was poisoned, how Nero became emperor. And I would argue, and I think most scholars would agree with me, that Nero was the worst emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and really helped to bring the dynasty to an end. He was corrupt, he was violent, he was accused of deviating from Roman gender and sexual norms, and really doing it in a very flagrant way, going out of his way almost to antagonize Romans, or wealthy Romans especially. He was accused of starting a great fire in Rome in 64 CE. That's something that scholars debate. Was he involved in it, or did he just benefit from the fire? And then in the end, he will commit suicide because he's on the run. They're trying to capture him, so he will commit suicide to avoid being executed for his crimes. And Nero's corruption and his poor leadership will lead to a very chaotic transitioning period in Roman history called the Year of the Four Emperors. This is the year 69 CE, in which there will be men like Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then eventually Vespasian will all be emperor during that year, 69 CE. Although Vespasian's rule will actually stick, and Vespasian will then be emperor for many years after. And Vespasian is a pretty good emperor, and he's the founder of the Flavian dynasty. And one of the reasons Roman emperors tended to have their adopted sons be their successors rather than their biological sons is because the Roman emperors needed to avoid being seen as kings. They needed to avoid the Roman public, especially wealthier Romans, thinking the emperor was a king, because Roman culture hated kings, distrusted kings, and emperors had basically the power of kings. So they recognized, at least the smart ones, recognized they could not live too extravagantly. They could not live too crazy of a lifestyle, otherwise they'd be seen as a corrupt king that could be overthrown, like Nero was overthrown, for example. The main documentary primary sources we have on these emperors are Suetonius's The 12 Caesars and Tacitus's Annals and Histories. And both of these documents were written about half a century after the events they describe. Tacitus would have been a young child during the reign of Nero. Suetonius was actually born during the 69 CE Year of the Four Emperors, so they're not going to remember or have been aware of the events that they're writing about, most of them. And there's issues with bias. These are classicizing histories written by elite men, Suetonius and Tacitus, elite Romans. They were always trying to ingratiate themselves to whoever was in charge, whatever emperor was in charge. So Suetonius and Tacitus, writing during the time of the Flavian dynasty, they're going to want to make the Julio-Claudian emperors sound as bad as possible. They'll glorify Augustus Caesar, the first emperor, but then they'll make all of his successors, they'll try to make them sound as bad as possible. So it's possible there's some significant exaggeration about the behavior of, like, Caligula and Nero, for example. Also, the sources that they would have been using, were they interviewing people who were in these palaces? Did they have any way to make sure that the stories they were being told were correct? So they're useful sources. They're definitely worth reading, but remember, these are classicizing sources written by wealthy Roman men who would have wanted to ingratiate themselves with the current people in charge by making the people in the past look bad. And of course, the sources themselves that they were using may not have been reliable. And the images on this slide, the left image is a bust of Suetonius from the period, and then on the right is a statue of Tacitus. It's not from Roman times, it's at the Austrian Parliament in Vienna. So we'll dig a little bit deeper into some of these Roman emperors because they will set the tone for Roman politics and Roman culture. This is Emperor Tiberius from 42 BC to 27 CE. That was his life. He's a successor of Augustus Caesar, and he was chosen by Augustus Caesar to be the next emperor. He was the adopted son of Augustus Caesar. He was seen by Augustus as being competent. He was a decent administrator, but Augustus Caesar wanted to choose a successor that was going to be good and competent, but not too good. He didn't want to choose someone that was going to be better than he was. So on the one hand, he wanted the Romans to have a good emperor after him, but he didn't want this emperor to be too good. And as emperor, in terms of imperial policy, I would say competent is a good way to describe Tiberius. He's a decent military commander. He's a decent administrator. But Tiberius himself, he probably really didn't want to be emperor. And also, he's forced to give up his relationship with the love of his wife. He's forced to divorce his first wife, and he's forced to marry Julia, the daughter of Augustus Caesar, in order to become the next emperor. So it's said that Tiberius had a very grim personality. That's what historians and authors wrote about Tiberius. And it's possible he was very grim because his marriage was broken up. He had to then enter a marriage of convenience. He was chosen to be emperor, a task that he maybe really didn't want. And his grimness will actually perhaps lead him to give up his job. And he'll basically withdraw from Rome and will sort of retire to the countryside, leaving a lot of the rule of the empire to a man named Sejanus, or Sejanus, if you want to get into the original traditional pronunciation. He is the Praetorian Guard commander, and Sejanus will have enemies executed, and also Sejanus himself is going to be executed by Tiberius. It's said that Tiberius, reflecting his grim personality, that he really liked to watch executions. That was entertaining to him. There's also rumors that he had certain sexual perversions, the kind of sexual perversions that really cannot be talked about on YouTube. And then it's also said that he abused Julia, who by then was his ex-wife and was in exile, and that his harsh treatment of Julia while she was in exile, basically having her imprisoned, led to her dying. Remember, he had to divorce his first wife, the love of his life, Vespania, in order to marry Julia and become the next emperor, which certainly would have been something that would have made Tiberius very upset and would have perhaps contributed to his grim personality. On the whole, though, he's a decent ruler, not as well loved as Augustus Caesar. Wealthy Romans did not really shed a tear when Tiberius died the way they did when Augustus Caesar died. But he's definitely going to be a much better emperor than his adopted son Caligula, the third Roman emperor. And this image is of a bust of Tiberius. It's from Toulouse, France. It's where it's housed, its museum. And you can see this bust is it's done in a Augustan style. Tiberius is represented with sort of a thin face, sort of a long nose, a lot like Augustus Caesar. He has a very sort of short hairstyle like Augustus Caesar, and he's copying the Augustan style, the Augustan image. I mean, he was basically sort of formed and put into command of the empire by Augustus, so it makes sense that Tiberius is going to maintain a very Augustan image for himself, even if he really didn't want to be emperor, and he was not as good of an emperor as Augustus Caesar was before him. As I said, though, he's still a decent, competent emperor. The next emperor is Caligula, also known as Gaius, Julius, Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus. Remember, the original Roman pronunciation is a little bit different. The original Roman Latin is pronounced differently. He lived from 12 CE to 41 CE. He was emperor for a very brief period, 37 to 41. His nickname, Little Boots, comes from the sort of military-style sandals he wore as a child. He was considered to be a bad emperor, although the first 6 or so months of his rule were said to be pretty good, but it went downhill very quickly. He was violent. He was accused of decadence, of various sort of sexual perversions, violating Roman sexual norms. And he did not follow in the footsteps of Augustus Caesar. There's even reports that he tried to make his horse a senator, although he may have been doing that more to mock the Senate than because he actually wanted his horse to be a senator. He didn't get along with the Senate. He seemed to antagonize the Senate. In the end, the Praetorian Guard and the senators are going to have him assassinated. And we have to also keep in mind that the main sources we have about Caligula, about his rule, they come after his death, and they would have certainly, most likely, have been biased against him for the reasons that I mentioned. Later authors would have wanted to ingratiate themselves with the current emperors, and they would have done that by making earlier emperors sound as bad as possible. This is a bust of Caligula, probably from his reign. It's in the Met, New York City Museum. It's made definitely in the Augustan style. It looks very similar to the statues of Augustus Caesar in terms of the face shape, the hairstyle, and some of the emperors during this period are going to adopt the Augustan style, others will not. Now I want to talk about Emperor Claudius, who will take the imperial position. He will become emperor after Caligula is assassinated. And he's actually the first Roman emperor that's going to be born outside of Italia. Over time, you're going to see more and more emperors are going to be from outside of Italia, from outside of the heartland of Rome, the cultural heartland of Rome. And one of the ways Claudius sought to show his power and show his worthiness for being emperor was by conquering Britannia, or expanding Roman territorial holdings into Britannia. Julius Caesar had invaded the British Isles himself, but had not been able to establish a permanent Roman presence there. He will begin this conquest of Britannia about the year 43 CE. And he wanted to show his imperial authority, flex his muscles, his imperial muscles, and basically what was happening before was the Celtic tribes of Britain had kind of been in a client-state relationship with Rome since Julius Caesar. Because Caesar had not been able to conquer them, they had sort of been made clients of Rome. At least that was how the Romans saw it. And territorial expansion in the British Isles will continue after the death of Claudius, although there will be a major Celtic rebellion by Queen Boudica, an important Celtic British leader. That rebellion is going to fail. It's going to be suppressed from 60 to 61 CE. And Romans will continue their expansion in the British Isles. They will establish Hadrian's Wall, and then later the Antonine Wall, further to the north in what is now Scotland. And that's going to be from like the 120s to the 140s CE. So probably the most important thing about Emperor Claudius was he begins the conquest of Britain. He begins the permanent presence of the Romans in Britain. Well, not permanent, because the Romans will eventually evacuate Britannia, but their centuries-long presence in Britannia will begin during the reign of Claudius. Emperor Claudius died in the year 54 CE. He was probably poisoned. That's probably how he died. And he's going to be replaced by the Emperor Nero. Nero was his adopted son. And Nero, as a young man, was tutored by Seneca, a Roman philosopher. And Seneca was a practitioner of Stoic philosophy. In addition to being a Stoic philosopher, Seneca may actually have also been the person who coined the term Pax Romana that we've been referencing throughout this video. And some things to note about Nero was that he didn't seem to be very interested in the lessons that Seneca tried to give him, particularly when it came to Stoic philosophy. Nero did not live his life by Stoic principles. Although we will say that Nero was a very talented musician, it was said, and that he was very interested in the arts. So there were certain things he did like, but Stoic philosophy was not one of those things. And eventually he's actually going to force Seneca to commit suicide. He's also going to have his mother killed. He's even going to kill his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina, as well. Although it appears that he killed his wife when he became angry with her. He did not plot her murder the way he did with his mother. So even though he had some good teaching as a young man, he certainly didn't live by those teachings for very long as an adult and as an emperor. And Stoic philosophy teaches that you should respect your enemies. You should not, if they insult you, you should bear those insults, control your emotions. Nero does not do that. He will mock his enemies and will deal with them very violently. And really, he violates the obligations of the princeps of the first citizen. He lacks virtue. He cares much more about himself and having a good time, and it really upsets a lot of Romans, especially upper-class Romans in Rome, who really come to view Nero as an embarrassment. Later, Christian historians write that Nero will persecute Christians, It's Christian historians saying this, and I think there's probably some good evidence to show that that did in fact occur during Nero's reign. Although Nero was probably just continuing policies of other Roman emperors like Claudius. Claudius had the Jewish population of Rome be basically kicked out of the city. And early on, the Romans regarded Christians as basically just a sort of a segment of the Jewish religion. And historical sources report all kinds of violent sexual perversions, that he abused people, both women and men, that there are things that were considered to be against the gender norms and sexual norms of Roman society. For example, there's a report that after Poppaea, his wife, died, he found a young man named Sporus who looked a lot like Poppaea, and he had young Sporus be castrated. And then he would take Sporus and dress Sporus up in women's clothing, and this was shameful to the Romans to treat a young man like this, to mutilate his body. Like the Greeks, the Romans thought that bodily mutilation was a horrible thing, and it was not something to be done lightly. And having a young man dress up as a woman was also shameful as well. And Nero didn't really care. Nero himself, it's reported, liked to dress in women's clothing, something the Romans would have looked down upon. And there's reports that he started the Great Fire of 64 CE. That way he would have space in downtown Rome to build his palace, which is called the Domus Aurea, or the Golden House. But the question is, what kind of archaeological evidence is there for these things? Documentary evidence is generally very stilted against Nero. On the subject of the Great Fire, it was said that maybe Nero was not actually in Rome when the fire took place. Perhaps he ordered it from afar, or maybe the fire just happened and he opportunistically took advantage of this fire as a way to have space to build his new palace. Basically, the fire demolished large parts of Rome, freeing up space for his palace. It's hard to say for sure because the historical documentary sources are written after his death. But we'll take a look at what evidence we have in the next couple of slides. This slide shows a bust of Nero. It's from the Munich Museum. It's probably actually from after 64 CE, so later in his reign. Nero will reign until 68 CE, and it's in a different style. He's shown with a much rounder face. He's shown as basically being overweight. Romans were supposed to be physically fit. It was part of the male beauty standard to be physically fit, to be slender, to be muscular. It seems that Nero had no interest in Roman standards, Roman male beauty standards. He liked to wear women's clothing, for example, not the kind of thing that a Roman man should do. It's also not in the Augustan style. His face is much rounder. His hair is a bit longer. It's not like an Augustan style statue that previous emperors, even bad ones like Caligula, still had Augustan style statues. So Nero is not even trying to embody the Augustan image of the first citizen. And then this is a 20th century sculpture of Seneca, a very frustrated looking Seneca trying to tutor a very bored looking Nero. I guess the idea that Nero didn't pay very good attention to Seneca's lessons, did not become a Stoic, and then ended up having Seneca commit suicide. So we'll talk about Nero and his mother, Agrippina the Younger, and she was the fourth wife, one of the wives of Claudius. Roman emperors frequently got divorced. Divorce was allowed in Roman society as it was allowed in Greek society, although it would have been initiated by men. And she is his fourth wife. She's also his niece as well, so that's certainly not something we would look fondly upon today. And she really wanted to make sure her son, Nero, the adopted son of Emperor Commodus, was going to become the next emperor. Nero was was born to Agrippina in a previous relationship. He is the adopted son, not the biological son of Claudius.
Yeah, Roman family trees can be pretty confusing and pretty intertwined as well, a lot like Egyptian family trees. And there's pretty good evidence that Agrippina was involved in the poisoning of Claudius. She probably wanted Claudius to be dead and be out of the way. That way, Nero could become the next emperor. And when Claudius was alive, it would seem that Nero was very disrespectful to Claudius, the next, the emperor. He didn't show a lot of respect for his adopted father. Um, Years ago, I learned in school that he used to play pranks on Claudius. He used to, when Claudius was asleep, he would take a sandal and put the sandal on Claudius's hand and tickle Claudius's nose with a feather, causing Claudius to hit his face with the sandal. Kind of like the shaving cream summer camp prank. When you're at summer camp, you put shaving cream in someone's hand and you touch their face, and they put shaving cream in their face. There's kind of silly stories like that. It's hard to say if any of those are really, really true or not, but it shows just sort of the disrespectfulness of Nero, and that he was seen as not being someone who was sober, who was in control of his emotions. He was not Augustus Caesar, and it's evident from an early age. And Agrippina was said to be a very indulgent mother to Nero, that she was perhaps spoiled him rotten. But it was also said that she was very overbearing, and she tried to almost rule through her son when she became emperor. And there's also rumors of relationships between Agrippina and Nero that you cannot talk about on YouTube. You get the idea. And Nero decided he had enough of this, and he conspired to have his mother killed. He didn't want his mother interfering with him anymore. And according to Tacitus, what ensued were a series of very strange, almost cartoonish, kind of Looney Tunes or Tom and Jerry-esque plans or traps that Nero orchestrated to try to have his mother be killed, because he wanted to make her death look like an accident, look like he was not responsible. So he has her ship rammed. He crashes one ship into her ship, and she survives this. And then, so she has to travel on another ship, a ship that's made by Nero. And this ship has a feature in the cabin that will cause the cabin roof to collapse. The idea is the roof will collapse on top of Agrippina, kind of like this trap here. It will kill her. But kind of like in the Tom and Jerry or in the Looney Tunes, Wile E. Coyote, Elmer Fudd cartoons, it fails. Wile E. Coyote's plan to kill the Roadrunner fails, and Nero's plan to kill his mother fails. She manages to survive the roof of the ship caving in on her, probably because her bedposts protected her. So this fails. So the sailors decide to run the ship aground so that it will sink and Agrippina will drown. But the thing is, she's able to swim to shore, and one of the sailors hits one of her female companions on the head with an oar, thinking he's killed Agrippina, but instead he's really just hit her companion instead. So she survives multiple attempts on her life from Nero using these crazy traps and plans. And in the end, Nero just orders his men to go in and beat her to death. And it was said that, realizing those men had come to kill her, she showed them her midsection, her belly, knowing that it was Nero who was ordering her death. And she said, basically, I'm being killed by the child that came out of me, by my own son. And to make things even more crazy, Nero inspected his mother's disemboweled and beaten corpse and said, oh, she was so beautiful, possibly hinting to the inappropriate relationships that happened between him and his mother. But this all takes place around the year 59 CE. We haven't found evidence of Nero's traps, but it's an interesting source, and certainly Tacitus would have wanted to make Nero sound as tyrannical and as maniacal as possible, killing his own mother. And here is a statue showing the head of Nero, and these are some modern sort of 3D generated images of what Nero may have looked like when he was alive. You can see he's certainly not a very handsome man. He was said to be overweight. It was said that he had boils on his skin. Maybe he had acne. It's hard to say for sure, but he had some kind of skin condition. He had longer hair than a Roman was supposed to have. Roman men were supposed to have very short hair. He had this sort of unusual chin strap beard. This is a period in which Roman men are generally clean shaven. So he's bucking a lot of Roman male beauty standards and gender norms. He's also bucking the Augustan style as well. He's not representing himself the way Augustus Caesar would have. And there's reports that Nero liked to wear women's clothing, certainly something that Romans would not have looked on fondly. In many ways, Roman society had very strict gender norms, and there were certain rules about how men and women were supposed to interact with each other, and Nero basically violated all those rules. He really didn't care what other people thought. He cared much more about what made himself feel good. And if anything, he probably bucked a lot of these rules because he liked to antagonize other people, probably a lot like Caligula did before him. And now we'll discuss the thing that Nero is probably the most famous for, and that is the Great Fire of 64 CE, which he may or may not have been involved in. There's the old report that Nero played his fiddle or played a string instrument of some kind while the city of Rome burned. That he basically didn't care about the suffering of the Roman people in the city, and he just sort of thought it was a joke. Other sources say that he was not actually in Rome when this happened. It's hard to say if he caused these fires or if he just took advantage of them. But Christian sources reported that he blamed the Christians for the fire. That way, the Romans would persecute the Christians rather than looking at him and saying, Nero, did you cause this fire? And the reason they might have asked, did Nero cause this fire? Well, they would have asked that because he will take the districts of Rome that were burned to the ground, and that's where he's going to build his golden house, his Domus Aurea, which is going to be much larger and much fancier than the Domus Augusti, the palace, the home of Augustus. And there's pretty good archaeological evidence for the burning of Rome or parts of Rome in 64. There are like this gate here that was clearly burned at high temperatures. It's warped and bent in a way that only a really, really large fire could have done things. The layers that correspond to about that year in Roman history, remember layers, we can use layers of earth, layers of strata. We can date those using stratigraphy. Stratigraphy basically means the dating of layers of strata. And the ones that correspond with about the year 64 CE have a lot of extra ash, a lot more ash than you would normally expect. So there's pretty good archaeological evidence that this fire did in fact exist, although pinning the evidence on Nero is kind of hard to do. And one more kind of archaeological note to make: fire is not always a bad thing in the archaeological record. Yes, fires can destroy things, they can turn things to ash. But sometimes ash can be very useful. It can be used to study minerals and things like that. And sometimes things can be carbonized by fire and by burning. We'll talk a bit more about carbonization in the next lecture when we discuss Pompeii and how it was preserved by the Mount Vesuvius eruption. So fires can be destructive. They're used by the Romans to cremate the dead. So you don't have a lot of evidence from human remains. It's a lot harder to study ashes in human remains, but sometimes ashes in layers of strata can be really useful. They can help us pinpoint the Great Fire, for example. So fire, not always a bad thing in terms of archaeology. Here are some examples of Roman stringed instruments. They would have had like harps and lyres, but they also would have had instruments like these. These are kitaras. With Latin, it's with a C, whereas with Greek, it's with a K. When you're translating into or transliterating into the English alphabet, it's with a K in Greek and then a C in Latin. And these are, of course, sort of the very, very early versions of a guitar. Even the word guitar kind of sounds like a kitara. They also would have had tambourines. They would have had aulos flutes, just like the Greeks. And it seems that Nero was very skilled in playing multiple musical instruments. And today there's nothing wrong with playing musical instruments, but to the Romans, they thought their emperors were supposed to be soldiers and political leaders, be sober men. Nero was much more interested in the arts. He was too interested in the arts, and that's going to be a problem for him. Here are some other Roman instruments that were being used during the Pax Romana. You have military instruments like this signal trumpet, which is called a tuba, sort of where we get the modern word tuba from tube in Latin. And then you have what's called a cornu, which actually looks more like a modern tuba, but it's not called a tuba. It's a different device. And these would have been used by the military, but they could have also been used in parades and things as well. The Romans had other instruments like what's called a hydraulis, or a water organ. This was an organ of Greek. This organ was of Greek origin, but the Romans had them as well. They would have used the hydraulis in like gladiatorial fights. They would have played this perhaps as the gladiators are marching into the arena. And it seems that Nero really liked the hydraulis, the water organ, even though it was a Greek instrument that was used by the Romans. In fact, he liked to play it. He was going to play it at a musical performance. He was going to give a recital. And one of the Romans that he didn't like, named Vindex, who was always criticizing Nero for not being a good emperor and not acting properly, Nero said, well, I'll play the hydraulis, but only if Vindex doesn't have any objections. Not that he really cared what Vindex thought, but he wanted to antagonize Vindex by mocking him and making him sound like he was stuffy. But Nero liked to play music. He liked to have long musical recitals. They would last hours and hours and hours. And it was said that women who were pregnant would go into labor during his performances and not be allowed to leave. They would give birth to their babies in the theater while Nero was playing his music. It was said that men would play dead. That way they'd be carried out and not have to listen to Nero's music anymore. They were so tired of hearing it. It was said that he was a good musician, but maybe the Romans just didn't want to listen to his music, or maybe Nero thought he was a lot better of a musician than he actually was. It's hard to say, but it does seem that he was at least capable of playing multiple instruments. By the way, the hydraulis was also played at bathhouses as well. And what's interesting is this fresco here shows a Roman musical performance. It's from Leptis Magna, which is present-day North Africa. And it shows men playing these brass instruments, the tuba and the cornu, but it actually shows a woman playing the hydraulis. So perhaps in Roman society, the hydraulis was one of the musical instruments that was perhaps seen as an instrument that maybe women played. And maybe that was why Nero liked it so much. He was trying to buck the gender norms of the day by playing a woman's musical instrument. It's hard to say for sure, but this mosaic is certainly very interesting. And of course, another reason that Nero was so hated was he did not follow the gender and sexual norms of Roman society. And gender and sexuality in ancient Rome were very complex, a lot like gender and sexuality in ancient Greece were. And there are some similarities between gender and sexual norms in Greece and in Rome. On the whole, I would say the Romans had a more fluid idea of sexuality than perhaps modern Western society does, a lot like the Greeks. That being said, though, there were still a lot of rules about how men and women were supposed to interact, how sexual encounters were supposed to go. There were a lot of rules even in this fluidity. Men and women had sexual relations in marriage to produce children. And there's also evidence that men had sex with both women outside of marriage and with other men. There's ample evidence that those relationships took place. Relationships with men and between men, a lot of the same rules that the Greeks had, the Romans had as well. You could have those relations with another man, but you did not want to be in what was seen as being the woman's position, the submissive position in a sexual relationship with another man. So the Romans had a lot of rules about sexual relationships between men and how they were supposed to take place in a way that would not make one man like a woman. And Nero, of course, did not obey any of those rules. He made Sporus, his male partner, a woman by dressing him in women's clothing. He mutilated Sporus as well, which would have been very shameful. And he violated other sexual and gender norms in his relationships with women as well. So it's a bit more fluid, the sexual relationships in ancient Rome, but there are still a lot of rules that have to be respected in order to be considered a morally upright Roman, something that Nero certainly was not. And sexual relationships for women were, of course, much more controlled. Women could not have sexual relationships outside of their marriages. Julia did this, and she was banished as punishment. But men, of course, had more opportunities to have sex outside of their marriage. And I would say, on the whole, over time, Roman society, I think, becomes more, you might say, sex negative in terms of their attitudes towards sex. Not just sex between men, homosexual relations, but just sex in general. Some people in the past argue this is because of the rise of Christianity, but more recent scholarship argues that actually Roman society became more sexually intolerant before the rise of Christianity. It probably had to do with just social unrest and political and economic turmoil that the Roman society experienced, certainly by the 200s, just made people a lot more closed off, and sexual relationships became even more taboo and more controlled. But even early in the Roman Empire, there were still rules that had to be abided. Roman men could have sex outside of their marriage, and they would have gone to places like brothels to have those relationships, to have sex with prostitutes or female sex workers. And we found what we think are brothel tokens, or spintrae, as they're called, and they often show sex acts. And some people think that the act that's being portrayed on the token was what that token was for, and basically some acts might have cost more than others, and you had to give the token that fit with the sexual service that you wanted. So there are a lot of rules about how these sexual relationships take place. In order to be a good, virtuous Roman, you could have, if you were a man at least, you could have sex outside of marriage with both men and women, but you had to follow the rules. And Nero doesn't follow the rules. In terms of visual art, there is pornographic visual art in Rome, as there is pornographic visual art in Greece. But in my opinion, I think that Roman visual art, or pornographic visual art, is much more focused on the act of sex rather than on the people involved. And remember, Roman artists were less comfortable with portraying male nudity than the Greeks were. So there is a fluidity to ancient Roman sexuality and things of that nature, but there's still a lot of rules as well. And good Romans will follow these rules, but bad Romans don't follow the rules, and Nero is certainly a bad Roman. This is a plan of what the Golden House, Nero's palace, the Domus Aurea, would have looked like. It features a very large courtyard. It features many different buildings. It has a sort of a miniature pond or miniature lake in the courtyard area. Nero liked to visit the seaside, and so he was probably trying to bring the sea to himself with this pond. And it's a very, very extensive palace. It was also going to have a colossus, or a statue of Nero, that was going to be very large to honor his image. And wealthy Romans will eventually, basically, they will try to demolish and tear down the Domus Aurea. So very little of it actually survives, and other buildings are going to be built on top of it. And it's probably because wealthy Romans just thought Nero was an embarrassment. He made Rome look bad by violating the gender norms, the sexual norms of the day, by being corrupt, by being violent. he was not a good patron of the Roman people. So they tried to erase elements of Nero, including his palace, which is interesting because even though the Romans in Rome often looked down on Nero and thought he was really awful, Roman people living outside of Rome didn't have as negative of an image of Nero because they didn't really deal with Nero. They didn't see him. They didn't have to go to his overly long musical performances. They didn't watch him, killing people or mutilating people and things like that. So because he stays in Rome predominantly. Either way, though, the wealthy Romans in Rome, they think that Nero is an embarrassment. They think his palace is too grand, and they think it's an embarrassment. They're going to tear down the palace. This slide shows a reconstruction of what the Domus Aurea might have looked like. It's got gold, it's got marble, it's very nice, it's very fancy, much fancier than Augustus's palace. It was built from 64 to 68 CE. 68 CE is when Nero's reign comes to an end and when he's going to flee Rome and then ultimately commit suicide to avoid being captured and killed. He chooses to have his own life be taken. He actually can't take his own life. He's too afraid to, so he has one of his own servants help him commit suicide because he's that much of a coward. According to documentary sources, they just have to show that Nero is a bad guy. And of course, it's called the Golden House because of the gold and the ivory and the jewels and the marble that is used to decorate the interior. And there were probably fresco painting as well, but it's a much more grandiose palace. There were reports that Nero had Christian people crucified and burned alive in the gardens of the Golden House, of the large courtyard. That way he would have light for his banquets. Although it's hard to say for sure if that actually happened or if that was a later report that was created to show the persecution of Christians. But once again, it adds to the idea that later Romans really looked down on Nero and viewed him as being just a really awful person. And after Nero's death, as I mentioned, most of the palace is demolished by the Flavian dynasty, that is Vespasian and Titus especially. They're going to want to build other buildings there, and parts of it may have been burned as well. And this was done to make room specifically for the Coliseum or the Flavian amphitheater, which is one of the most famous Roman buildings. It would have been built to honor the Roman people, to give them a place to watch gladiatorial games, and it would have legitimized the rule of the Flavii, the Flavian emperors. They're tearing down the corrupt Nero's palace, tearing it to the ground, and building a Coliseum, a building for the Roman people. And also, Nero was an embarrassment to wealthy Romans with his extravagance. And the Golden House was rediscovered during the Renaissance, and what little decorations were left behind have really deteriorated due to the high humidity of the site. They were just buried underground, and there was a lot of humidity and things like that. So you can't really see what the Golden House must have looked like in its glory days. This is the sort of the interior of the Golden House. Most of the decoration is no longer there. It would have been stripped away and taken to other places or recycled by the Romans. And what is left is deteriorated due to humidity and other factors. At this time, it's closed to the public because it's a very dangerous site because it could collapse, and restorative work needs to be done on what's left of the building. So unfortunately, you can't visit the Golden House if you go to Rome, but this gives you an idea of what the remains of the site look like. Here you can see restoration work being done to preserve the structural integrity of the Golden House. The Romans may not have liked the Golden House. They probably wanted to forget it even existed. That's why they had it torn down. But for archaeologists and historians, preserving this site can help us learn more about Nero, can help us learn more about Roman society during the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And also, the more investigation we do at this site, we'll be able to find material sources that can corroborate the documentary sources that we have. Or we might find material evidence that actually goes against these documentary sources. We might find that maybe Nero was not so bad as as Suetonius and Tacitus say he was. So it's definitely an important site, and it's worth investigating and preserving. This diagram shows the lengths of Roman emperors' reigns, and what you find is that generally speaking, when the emperors are reigning for longer, it's better for Rome, better for the Roman civilization. When Roman emperors are reigning for short periods of time, it's a sign of problems. It means these emperors are not well respected, they're doing bad things, and they're being deposed, they're being forced out of power, and there's fights over who's going to be the next emperor. So Augustus Caesar, one of the best, if not the best Roman emperor, he rules for 41 years. But then after Nero, there's the year of the four emperors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, who one was replaced after the other. It's a time of turmoil in the Roman civilization as they're getting ready for the Flavian dynasty to rise. And of course, Vespasian and Titus are both pretty good emperors. Domitian, however, is not as good of a Flavian emperor. And later in future videos, you'll see that during the crisis of the 200s, emperors had only ruled for a year or a matter of months. For about 50 years, that's the norm, and it's really bad for the Roman civilization. It's a real serious problem. So when you're looking at a big timeline of Roman emperors, when you see an emperor who has a long reign, that's a good sign. When you see an emperor that's ruling for a very short period of time, it's a bad sign. And it gets to the point that at certain points of Roman history, perhaps during this year of the four emperors, wealthy Romans and even poorer Romans will look and say, emperors change like the weather, and it's frustrating, it's not good for Rome, but what can you do about it? Because the Roman Empire is not a democracy, although there is a Senate, and although everyday Romans can vote on some things, they can't vote an emperor out of power. They can't choose who their next emperor is. Emperors will choose their successors, and then they'll be removed from power by other wealthy Romans who will rise up if they're doing bad things, as what happened with Nero.
Now I want to talk about the Principate, that is, the office of the Princeps, the first citizen, basically the Roman emperors after Nero. So from about 68 CE to about the early 200s CE. And after Nero, there were good Roman emperors, and then there were bad Roman emperors as well. And some of the good emperors included Emperor Vespasian, seen here on the right-hand side of the slide. This is a modern plaster version of a older Roman era bust of Vespasian. It shows him in military garb, highlighting Vespasian, his career as a general, and then of course as a Roman emperor as well. Titus, the son of Vespasian, was also a good emperor, and Vespasian and Titus will be the founders of the Flavian dynasty. After Vespasian and Titus, some other good emperors are the five good emperors. The five good emperors was a term coined by Niccolo Machiavelli, a Renaissance Italian political theorist, and the five good emperors were Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. And these five good emperors in a row, they will create what is called the Roman Golden Age. This is a period of great economic prosperity, cultural achievement within the larger Roman Pax Romana. But there's bad emperors as well. Some of the bad emperors include Domitian. Domitian was also a son of Vespasian. He was a brother of Titus, but he was not a good emperor the way his father and brother were. Other bad emperors are Commodus. Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was a very good emperor, but his son Commodus was not a good emperor at all. The acorn fell very far from the tree with Commodus. Other bad emperors are Caracalla and Elagabalus. These are emperors that are viewed as being bad or not having a good reputation, not enacting good policies. And good emperors will rule wisely. They will champion good policies that help the Roman people. They will put the Roman people and Rome before themselves. They will lead successful military campaigns, they will be good generals, and in their personal and private lives, they will practice virtue, and they will be an example, and they will uphold their obligations as the princeps, as the first citizen. They're going to be the patron of the Roman people, their clients. Bad emperors, however, they're going to champion bad policies, policies that are unwise, policies that are not good for the Roman civilization and people. They will fail militarily as well. And then in their personal lives, they will not practice virtue. They will not adhere to Roman social norms. They will not live up to the title of being a good Roman emperor. And therefore, they will be considered bad emperors. And I should also add that good is a very relative term here. Good doesn't necessarily mean moral or just. Good means effective, and they did good things for the Roman people, even if those things maybe were not good for other people. For example, Emperor Vespasian, he's considered to be a good Roman emperor. He was a very successful general. He was certainly very brutal with his putting down of the Jewish rebels during the Jewish War of 63 to 73 CE. After Vespasian becomes emperor, Titus will finish the destruction of the Jewish revolt, and Jerusalem and the Jewish temple will be destroyed as part of that in the year 70 CE. So good is a relative term. A good emperor could still be very brutal with his enemies. And the images on this slide, again, Vespasian on the right. This is a modern recreation of a Roman bust showing him in military garb. And then on the left-hand side of the slide, this is a bust of Elagabalus, who's considered to be a bad emperor. And we'll talk about why Elagabalus is regarded that way later in this video. One very interesting thing about Vespasian is his sense of humor. And of course, this is something you're going to see from documentary sources, sources that write down the things that he reportedly said, as opposed to an archaeological find necessarily. But it's still worth discussing. Vespasian was a successful general, but he had a sense of humor that he probably used to lighten the mood and to kind of loosen tension in difficult moments. It's part of being a good leader, finding a way to de-escalate a controversial or difficult situation. And he may have used jokes and plays on words to do this. So Vespasian did not come from an especially wealthy background. And a lot of the elite, or at this point what they're called, is the senatorial class people, the kind of people who become senators. They look down on Emperor Vespasian because of his, well, he had basically what we would call like a working class or vulgar dialect. A vulgar today, that's like a word. If you call someone vulgar, it's like an insult, but I'm using the term vulgar as in of the people. He used the vulgar Latin dialect. And there's many different Latin dialects. There's regional dialects. The Latin spoken in Rome is going to be different than the Latin spoken in Gaul or Britannia. And then, of course, there's also class-based dialects. There's the vulgar Latin of the people. And then there's the Latin of wealthy elite Romans. Kind of like, you don't notice it as much in American English, but in British English, there's what is called the received pronunciation, the very proper British accent spoken by like the King or the Queen of England. But then there's the Cockney accent, where you don't pronounce the letter T. That's the accent of a working class person, specifically from London. And there's regional accents as well. And Latin had this the way English does. And of course, American English doesn't so much have class-based accents, but it has regional accents, a Southern accent, a Northeastern New York accent, a Midwestern accent. So Latin has these accents. Vespasian didn't use the kind of accent that an emperor should have used, but instead of getting all bent out of shape about it, he actually makes light of it. In a speech, he says the word for wagons. Plaustra is how you pronounce it in proper upper-class Latin, but he says plastra, more working-class Latin. And a wealthy Roman, an ex-consul named Florus, gives him a hard time about it, criticizes him for it. But instead of having Florus killed or having Florus tortured or punished the way maybe a bad emperor would have done, Vespasian calls him Flaurus next time he sees him. So he kind of makes fun of Florus's name. He makes fun of Florus for criticizing him for his accent. He says, "Oh, hey there, Florus," to show that he heard what he said, but he's not taking it too seriously, rather than getting really angry and upset and losing his cool. This was Vespasian's skill, his sense of humor. He used it to de-escalate difficult situations. On another occasion, Titus, son of the emperor of Vespasian, complained about the taxes that were being put on the contents of public urinals. Urine was used by the Romans to process wool. It basically would bleach wool and make it more white because of the ammonia. Really, really gross, but a good source of money, and that was the point. Vespasian took a coin and threw it at Titus and said, "Here, smell this coin. Does it smell funny to you?" And Titus says, "No, it smells fine." And he's like, "Well, it's funny. It came from a urinal." It didn't actually come from a urinal. It came from the urinal tax. Basically, Vespasian was saying, yeah, the tax on urine sounds silly, but it's bringing wealth into the empire, so you shouldn't criticize it. And by the way, if anyone ever tells you to smell money, don't do it. It's a very bad idea. And it's even said that Vespasian's last words were a joke. He was on his deathbed. He was dying. And it was said that in one of his last things he said, maybe his last words were, "Well, it looks like I'm about to become a god," referencing the cult of the emperor, because Roman emperors became gods, but after they died. So perhaps he was trying to lighten the mood, the fact that he was dying, to make those around him not feel sad, get one last chuckle out of them before he passed away. So that was the kind of man that Vespasian was. Basically, he told a lot of funny jokes, corny jokes. Maybe they were the Roman equivalent of dad jokes. Here he's telling Titus he has a son, and Titus is saying, "No, not more jokes." But that was the kind of person he was. He always had a joke to lighten the mood in a difficult situation. This relief from the Arch of Titus shows Roman soldiers coming back victorious on a triumph after their defeat of the Jewish rebels in the Jewish War of 63 to 73 CE. You can see the Roman soldiers wearing crowns of olive leaves to symbolize their victory. You can see them carrying spoils of war, a menorah taken from the Jewish temple. The temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE. And the cause of this rebellion by the Jews was the Roman authorities have been putting a lot of extra pressure on Jewish people in the Roman provinces. They were even doing things like taking gold and taking other items out of the Jewish temple. The Jewish temple was very ornate, very well decorated, very fancy, but it's a sacred place to the Jewish people. It's where they go to worship their God. They're one God. The Jews only have one God, unlike the Romans, who are polytheistic, who have many gods. And because of Roman imperial policy and taking of the Jewish people's religious articles from the temple, they will choose to revolt against Rome. And this revolt will go from 63 to 73. The temple will be destroyed in the year 70. And what gold and silver and goods are left after the temple is being destroyed, the Romans will take with them on their triumphal parade back in Rome. And the Jewish revolt initially is being suppressed by Vespasian, but it is going to be completed by Titus, because Vespasian becomes emperor during that period, during the revolt. And I should say there's other long-term reasons why the Jewish people wanted to rebel against the Romans, in addition to the immediate factor of having items taken out of their temple. The Jewish people wanted to be free. They wanted to be independent. They had wanted to be independent of the Seleucid Greeks as well, and they were actually successful in their bid to gain independence from the Seleucid Greeks, but they're not going to be successful against the much more powerful Romans. Also, Jewish culture is monotheistic. It has only one God, whereas Roman culture is polytheistic. It has many gods. Other elements of Jewish culture and Roman culture are just not compatible, and so the Jewish people will choose to rebel against the Romans, and the Romans will respond by brutally suppressing this rebellion and destroying their temple. This is the triumphal arch of Titus. It was erected about the year 81 CE. It says in Latin, the Senate and the people of Rome to the god Titus, son of the god Vespasian Augustus, tying these emperors back to Augustus Caesar. This inscription on this side of the arch, the reverse, is not original. It mentions a restoration project done in the early 19th century, partnership between the Pope and an architect to try to restore the arch to its original appearance. So basically, the Arch of Titus has had significant restoration work done on it. Here are some very ornate coffers on the arch that you would have to pass under. You could see the very intricate workmanship that was used on this arch. These were this arch features elements of Roman architecture, like the columns of the composite order. You're seeing a Roman true arch, and then you're seeing, of course, these coffers as well. So it's a very impressive piece of architecture in terms of its architectural features, but also in terms of its decorations as well. This is an image of another work of architecture from the Flavian dynasty. It's the Flavian amphitheater, also known as the Coliseum. Coliseum is a reference to the Colossus statue that Nero was said to have had built for himself. That statue presumably was torn down, and this amphitheater was built on top of where the statue was, on top of where the old golden house of Nero was. And instead of building a palace, the Flavii are building a public building, basically a sporting stadium for the Roman people, is what the Colosseum was. And it's a very impressive building, built in about the year 80 CE. It features arches on the levels, and then you also can see the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian/composite orders used. So they're using 3 different orders of columns, and then they have arches. It's a very Roman building. Stylistically, it's very Roman, but also it's built for to have sporting events, especially gladiatorial games, which were a major part of Roman culture. We'll talk more about gladiators, who they were and what they did a little bit when we get to Commodus, but then a lot more in our next video. This is a cross-section of the Colosseum and what it might have looked like when it was being used by the Romans. The best seats were at the lowest level for the emperor and his attendants and the senators and upper-class Romans. And each level, as you go up, is for a lower level on the social ladder. So as you go up, it's poorer people, basically. And there were awnings that could have been pulled out to shield people from the hot Italian summer sun, so they could also probably see better, see the gladiatorial fights. Underneath the main arena actually comes from the Latin word for sand, because sand would have been put on the floor. Sand would have soaked up the blood from gladiatorial warriors, from animals that were killed, from people who were executed for entertainment. They would have fought in the sand, and then underneath there were storage areas, there were cells where prisoners were kept, cages where animals were kept before they would be brought onto the arena for the fights, for the entertainment. It was also said that the arena could be flooded with water so that they could have mock naval battles. So many different types of shows were put on at the Colosseum. People would have gone in, they would have watched these games. These games were put on by wealthy Romans for the entertainment of poor Romans. It was part of that system of patronage. And we'll talk more about what would have happened at a day at the amphitheater in our next video. Here is the Colosseum today. Originally, it would have the walls would have gone all the way around, but there's been earthquakes and other events that have caused the Colosseum to sustain a lot of damage over the years. You can see the lower levels underneath the arena where performers, gladiators, prisoners, wild animals would have been moved and put onto the upper level for their performances or fights. And of course, people would have come in and out of these arches, which are called vomitoria. And contrary to popular belief, the vomitoria got their name not because people went there to vomit and throw up because they ate too much food, because they were too decadent. This was probably more because people kind of vomited in and vomited out. People would come in all at once to watch the shows, and then they would leave all at once. You think about when you go to a ball game today and everybody's rushing out of the stadium at once and there's like traffic jams of people. That's really what the vomitorium were. They were not just a place that people went and threw up. I mean, I'm sure that somebody threw up in some sort of entryway. They had a little too much to drink perhaps, but they were not built for the purpose of throwing up. So we'll talk about some of the other important Roman emperors during the Pax Romana. Obviously, we're not talking about every single one. Emperor Trajan is a standout, a very important Roman emperor. He was born in Hispania, actually, so further from the heartland around Rome. He was born in 53 CE, and what you'll see is that over time, more and more emperors are going to be from outside of Italia. And he was a very successful general and military officer. He was emperor from 98 to 117 CE, and during Trajan's reign, because of his military successes, Rome will reach its greatest territorial extent. They're going to fight the Dacians in the Danube River Valley, what is now Romania, roughly speaking, and then they're also going to extend their empire as far east as the Persian Gulf, well into what is now modern-day Iraq. Although some of these territories will be lost. But of course, a lot of wealth is brought into the empire through Trajan's conquests. Unfortunately, though, it wasn't enough, and Trajan will have to devalue the currency. It will be debased. The silver currency, its purity will drop from about 93.5 to about 89%. And this was to pay for the wars, to pay for infrastructure, and to pay for basically what's called the alimenta, a sort of social welfare program for poor Romans, especially in urban areas. The Romans Roman patrons would feed poor Romans. That was the custom, patrons feeding their clients. But over time, the Roman state and Roman government becomes more involved in this feeding of poor Romans. And they'll issue, originally it was bread, but also they would issue like kind of a wheat that would be used to make a porridge. And this would be paid for. Over time, it becomes more and more funded by the Roman government rather than just by individual wealthy Romans. And of course, that costs money. And in order to have more money, they will decide to debase their currency. And currency had been debased before. It had been debased by Nero, actually, to, I guess, pay for his golden house and pay for his musical performances. But they're going to be doing more and more debasement of the currency over time after Trajan. And persecution of Christians will continue during Trajan's reign. But it seems that Trajan was not a very aggressive believer in persecution of Christians. He suggested that the violence ought to be toned down, and that if you're going to accuse someone of being a Christian, you should have really good evidence to support it. He actually writes to Pliny the Younger, a Roman author and Roman politician, saying, if you're going to try someone for being a Christian, make sure you have good evidence. So perhaps a more sober approach to persecuting Christians. And on the whole, Trajan is considered to be a good emperor, one of the 5 good emperors. Successful military commander. He did not want to see people be denied due process in their trials. Philanthropic work, taking care of the Roman people. Although he did debase the currency, which is not as good of a thing. And this slide shows a bust of Trajan. It's definitely a bit more of an Augustan style. It shows Trajan with sort of a narrower face, longer nose, shorter hair, although it shows him with a bare chest, which is a little bit different. Nudity was not something that Roman men were as comfortable with having portrayed in art, but they've decided to portray him this way here. This piece is at the British Museum in London. And this is Trajan's marble column. It's about 35 meters or 115 feet high. It's hollow. And Trajan actually would have had his ashes buried in this column, although the ashes have been lost. They're not there anymore. But this column is intricately carved, showing military scenes from Trajan's conquest, mainly of Dacia. And it's almost like an ancient Roman comic strip. But we'll look at the relief more closely on the next slide. This is a close-up of Trajan's column. Remember, the column, like other elements of Roman sculpture, it would have been painted. You can see Roman soldiers, Roman legionaries fighting against barbarians, auxiliaries, non-Roman citizens, people who were living in the empire but not citizens. They fought as auxiliaries. They're portrayed on the column as well. It's one of the best pieces of visual art that we have, and it's a great source for Roman military history, one of the best sort of visual art pieces of Roman military history that we have. We get a good idea of how Roman armor would have looked. We get a good idea of Roman tactics and strategy. It's a really spectacular building and a spectacular artifact to study. And as I said, it was hollow with a staircase. Trajan's remains would have been buried at the base or the plinth of the column, but the remains are not there anymore. They've been lost. So a couple more standout Roman emperors are Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian was born in 76 CE in Hispania, just like Trajan. He's a cousin of Trajan as well. And he was less interested in conquering new territory for Rome. He was much more interested in shoring up his predecessors' territorial gains and integrating it, rather than conquering and bringing a lot of new territory and new spoils of war into the empire, which is understandable. You have to integrate the territory you're conquering, but the Roman economy and the Roman military, the wealth they brought in for their conquest, it covered the cost of having a large military, but it also was good for the Roman economy. The wealth, the gold, the silver, and the slaves that were brought in enriched the Roman economy. So this is going to maybe not be as good of a strategy in the long term, chosen by Hadrian. Hadrian will build Hadrian's Wall in northern Britannia, once again showing he's trying to consolidate and shore up territorial holdings of the Roman Empire. He's also going to rebuild the Pantheon, as mentioned earlier in this video. And during his reign, he's going to tour the empire extensively. He's not just going to stay in Rome. And that gives his citizens and non-citizen provincial residents a chance to view their emperor. And Trajan, one of the reasons why he traveled was because he wanted to integrate the Roman people, or the multi-ethnic peoples that were living in Rome. Ethnic Romans who spoke Latin, who were of Italian ancestry, wanted to integrate them with Greeks, with people from northern Europe, Gauls, Celtic people in Britain, people in North Africa as well, and in the Middle East, integrate all of these different people together into a large empire. He also would suppress revolts like the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea. It's another Jewish revolt against the Romans. He will also have infrastructure projects constructed to bring everyone together. So he's trying to consolidate the empire through construction projects like Hadrian's Wall, infrastructure projects. He rebuilds the Pantheon to show the power of Rome. He will also try to bring in the different cultures of the Roman people together, although he will use violence when necessary, like in the Bar Kokhba revolt. He had a very strong interest in Greek culture. Hadrian liked to dress in Greek-style clothing, as you can see in this statue here. This statue is from the British Museum. I mention this because there appear to be several fakes of this statue of Hadrian wearing a Greek-style cloak, but this one's in the British Museum. It appears to be authentic, although there are some fake ones out there that were made much later imitating an older piece. But he also changes fashion as well. He makes beards the fashion for men. Beards were associated with philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. They're more associated with Greek culture to the Romans. And the Romans generally, Roman men preferred to not have beards, but Hadrian makes beards the fashion. They're going to be the fashion for the next, well over the next 100 years. They're going to be more the norm for Roman men, well into, I would say, the early 300s. So he redefines fashion even as he's trying to integrate the empire. And he was married to a woman named Vibia Sabina. She was his third cousin, which we wouldn't really support today. But he also had a relationship with a young man named Antinous, who was basically his lover. And this relationship would have begun when Antinous was underage by our standards today. So there's things we can really admire Hadrian for, and there's things that we can criticize him for as well. And Hadrian was generally disliked by the Senate because he spent a lot of time outside of Rome. He was interested in non-Roman cultures, but he's still considered to be a good and effective emperor. He's part of Machiavelli's list of the 5 good emperors. And again, the images on this slide, it's Hadrian in a Greek-style cloak. There are real versions of this statue, or a real version, and then there's fabricated fake versions. And then this is a bust of Hadrian that was found. It's from about the year 130 CE, and it's actually housed in the Munich Museum. As I said, we're not talking about every Roman emperor during this period, but we're talking about some of the standouts. Hadrian is certainly a standout because of Hadrian's Wall and because of his decision to focus more on integration of the empire rather than territorial expansion. Another standout emperor is Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is generally considered to be the last emperor of the Pax Romana. He was born in 121. He rules from 161 to 180. He's the heir of Antoninus Pius, a previous emperor. Antoninus Pius built another wall in what is now Scotland to keep the Scottish or Caledonian people from attacking the Romans. And he actually marries Faustina, who is the daughter of Pius, the previous emperor. And he's known for being a successful military commander and as well as a philosopher. Marcus Aurelius will spend a lot of his time as emperor fighting on the frontier, fighting in the Danube River Valley against Germanic and people called the Sarmatians. The Sarmatians are related to the Scythians. They come from like the north coast of the Black Sea, roughly what is now like Crimean Peninsula, Ukraine, and they will be enemies of the Romans. And he will also author a book called Meditations, which basically it's a famous work of Stoic philosophy. It's sort of, you might say they're Marcus Aurelius's shower thoughts. They're kind of very deep, pithy kind of sentences where he talks about the importance of having grace under pressure, doing the right thing even when it is difficult, when you're suffering. It seems like the kind of thing that a military officer who's spending long periods of his life living in a cold, drafty tent would write, so that he could be at peace about the difficult situation he's living. It's a very Stoic work. It's definitely a work of Stoic philosophy that is absolutely worth reading. It's very easy to read. It's very accessible to modern readers. I definitely recommend reading his Meditations. During Marcus Aurelius's reign, there is trade between Rome and Asia, as far to the east as India and China. And that's really a great thing because it allows exchange of goods and exchange of ideas. But trade networks can also lead to the spread of plagues. And it seems that there's a plague called the Antonine Plague that probably came from the east. And the Antonine Plague affects the Roman Empire from about 165 to 180 CE. And of course, it's very destructive for the Roman people to have to deal with this plague for 15 years. And Marcus Aurelius will die on campaign, but for unknown reasons. It's possible he died from this plague. There was persecution of Christians during his reign, although it appears that Marcus Aurelius did not really support the persecution of Christians. He thought that it was not something that was worth his time. And if anything, if it was continuing during his reign, it was not something that he had begun. It was something that just had been happening. Although we don't really know exactly what his attitude towards the persecution of Christians was, because later sources write about Marcus Aurelius, and they're later Christian sources, and it's possible that the later Christian authors were trying to make Marcus Aurelius seem like a protector, an ally of Christians. That way the Christians could say that, hey, we're Romans too. Even Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius supported us. So it's hard to say what Marcus Aurelius' specific attitude was towards Christians, but it appears that he may not have been as enthusiastic about the persecution of Christians as other Romans were. And on the more negative side, though, Marcus Aurelius did not choose an adopted heir. He chose his biological son, Commodus. And his hope was that Commodus would be a good son. He tried to teach his son to be a good emperor, and that was probably his biggest mistake, was having his son be his successor. But overall, Marcus Aurelius was I would say, a good emperor. He just had someone who was very incompetent replace him. And this slide shows material culture related to Marcus Aurelius. This is a bust from perhaps 170 to 180 CE, and this is actually a column of Marcus Aurelius. It's a little bit smaller than the one built for Trajan, but it has a similar style, showing military scenes up its sides. So Marcus Aurelius is copying Trajan, his predecessor, and as far as how he's choosing to have himself attired, he's wearing a Roman-style uniform, but he has longer hair than other Roman emperors, and he has a longer beard. And this is also to symbolize that he's a philosopher. Philosophers generally had longer hair and longer beards. Of course, beards at this point were becoming the style for Roman men, but his is a bit longer to highlight his sort of philosophical beard stroking, you might say. This is the Mausoleum of Hadrian. As you can see here, it's had very extensive remodeling done, or not so much remodeling, but being repurposed for a different purpose. It was built as a tomb for Hadrian, but Marcus Aurelius, his remains were interred there as well. Although their remains are not there anymore, the site was used for different things at different points in history. It was probably turned into a military fortress about the early 400s CE. And you can see evidence of the building being used as a military fortress. It's sometimes referred to as being a castle as well. It's in a very militarily strategic location on the eastern bank of the Tiber River, outside of the city of Rome. Remember, Romans did not like to build their tombs inside their cities. They'd build them on the outskirts. But this building was turned into a fortress in the past. It was repurposed, probably because in the early 400s, Rome was being attacked by Visigoths and other barbarian groups. And this tomb, being that it has these round walls, would have been a really good kind of fortress, or sometimes it's even referred to as a castle. That's very common in history and archaeology. Seeing an archaeological site be used for one thing and then be repurposed by people in the past for something else. And so now you have history from two different eras. You have Hadrian's Mausoleum as a tomb, which is important and worth preserving, but then Hadrian's Mausoleum made into a castle or fortress. That's also historical and very important. And archaeologists and historians have to figure out how to do good research and good investigation without destroying other types of history. You see this a lot in American battlefield archaeology, especially in the Yorktown Peninsula in Virginia. At that site, the Battle of Yorktown, the final really big battle of the American Revolutionary War, takes place. George Washington defeats the British with some French assistance, and it's a very historic site. That's from the 1780s. But then there was a lot of fighting at Yorktown during the Civil War, almost a century later in the 1860s. And in order to investigate the Revolutionary War, they had to dig through Civil War era earthworks and Civil War era fortifications. So they actually had to kind of destroy some Civil War era archaeology Civil War era fortifications and things to find stuff from the Revolutionary War. So archaeologists and historians always have to kind of balance their investigation with, one, not damaging a site, just in the general sense, but also not damaging other historically relevant evidence. This evidence of the mausoleum being used as a military fortress is important as well, just as its original purpose as a tomb is important and worth being investigated further. So now that we've discussed Marcus Aurelius, his life, his imperial policies, his final resting place, we can talk about Commodus, who is not a chip off the old block. The acorn fell very far from the tree when it came to Commodus. He was not his father, that's for sure. He was born in 161, and he will rule from 177 to about 192 CE. And the Pax Romana, we would argue, has come to an end with Commodus's rule. He becomes emperor at the age of 16, one of the youngest men to come to the role of princeps, first citizen. He was arguably not ready for this job. His style as emperor was very dictatorial. Roman emperors, they're supposed to be authoritative, but they're not supposed to come across acting too much like a king, being too arrogant. And that's exactly what Commodus does. He's actually going to try to make himself a god while he is still alive. Roman emperors were deified, made into gods, but it was something that happened after their death. Commodus tries to begin that process while he's alive. He'll also argue that he is Hercules reborn. He'll be portrayed wearing a lion's skin because Hercules killed a lion and wore its skin. Commodus was also very scandalous. He wanted to be a gladiator. And gladiators were generally looked down upon in Roman society. They were generally slaves or non-Roman people who were forced to fight. It was not something that a wealthy Roman or an emperor should be doing, becoming a gladiator. But Commodus will become a gladiator, something that was scandalous to Romans, especially to Romans of the upper class. There's also going to be a fire during Commodus's reign as emperor, kind of like during Nero's reign. And because of the fire, the city, large parts of the city are going to need to be rebuilt. Commodus will use this as an excuse to pronounce himself to be the new Romulus. And he's going to try to refound Rome. He's very, very Neronian, a lot like Nero in this regard, very arrogant, bucking social norms, upsetting Romans, especially wealthy Romans. And in the end, he will have his enemies executed and killed. And this will actually lead to some people that have been selected for execution. They're going to pay Narcissus, Commodus's trainer and sparring partner, to kill Commodus. And Commodus is going to be strangled, I believe, in the baths by Narcissus. And then he's going to be declared a public enemy by the Senate after his death. And the Pax Romana kind of comes to an end at the end of the reign of Marcus Aurelius and during the reign of Commodus. And during the Pax Romana, the Romans had good emperors and they had bad emperors. And there is division and there is social strife. But the social strife is going to be a lot worse after the reign of Commodus. And it's going to culminate with the crisis of the 200s. So it wasn't just Commodus himself that causes the crisis of the 200s. There's bad policies that were even made by good emperors. You know, Hadrian, a good emperor, he had some bad policies because he decides to focus more on shoring up Roman territorial holdings rather than extending and bringing in new spoils of war. Trajan, a good emperor, had some bad policies because he devalued the currency, which was not good for the Roman economy. So before Commodus, the good outweighed the bad, allowing the Pax Romana to continue. But during Commodus's reign, the bad things, bad imperial policies begin to outweigh good policies, bringing an end to the Pax Romana and bringing on the crisis of the 200s. This is the Emperor Commodus. It's a modern era painting of him dressed as a gladiator, leading the gladiators into the arena. Wealthy Romans don't seem to be very happy about this. They seem kind of annoyed with Commodus, but Commodus doesn't seem to care. And in the end, Commodus, of course, is going to be assassinated by his own trainer at the behest of wealthy Romans. And as we're beginning to wrap up this video, I want to mention sort of a longue durée of Roman military operations. Longue durée is basically French for long term or long duration. And early on, during Augustus Caesar's rule, Romans are going to continue to expand territorially, although it's going to be at a slower rate. There will be territorial gains, like Claudius's conquest in Britain. But really, the conquests are going to be slower because the wealthiest civilizations around the Mediterranean basin have been conquered. There is wealth that can be brought in from other civilizations further away from the Mediterranean Sea, but there's kind of a diminishing return on Roman conquest. You're fighting very militaristic enemies. The Celtic people in Britain, very militaristic. The Germanic people in Germania and in the Danube River Valley, very militaristic. And there is wealth to be brought back, but there's a diminishing return. And as the empire is getting bigger and bigger, supply lines are going to be stretched. And even with those great Roman roads, it's going to be harder to keep the armies well fed on the frontier. That's going to be leading to the military becoming a lot more expensive to operate. By 117 CE, because of the conquests of Trajan, the empire is going to reach its largest point, and later emperors like Hadrian are going to try to focus more on defense with short-term campaigns. There's still going to be campaigns after Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius's campaign, for example. But theoretically, defense is supposed to be easier than offense, but defense is arguably more expensive. It doesn't bring the kind of revenue into the empire. The Romans are going to have to resort to taxation and things like this to pay their Roman soldiers because they're not bringing as much spoils of war, as much booty into the empire to pay the soldiers and to pay for other infrastructure projects, feeding the poor and things like that. Taxes will need to increase. And also debasement of currency is going to be done as well to try to pay for the military and these infrastructure and social projects. Even though the empire is focusing more on defense and offense, though, its military is getting bigger. There's about 100,000 troops in the legions, and I think that includes auxiliaries as well, during Augustus Caesar's reign. But then there's possibly as many as 400,000 troops in the early 200s. Even though the Roman military is not bringing as much wealth into the empire, their military is larger and more expensive. So that's kind of a problem. It's going to lead to some serious issues, kind of like what happens after the Marian reforms. And with fewer options for military glory as well, because there's a lot more defense than offense, fewer Romans the best Romans are not as interested in military service. The army is getting bigger, but the best, the smartest, the most talented Romans would rather focus on other things. They'd rather focus on business or getting into politics rather than going into the military. There just doesn't seem to be the kind of draw. There's diminishing return, as I mentioned before. And this is an image of Hadrian's Wall built in northern Britannia to keep the Caledonian, Scottish, or Celtic peoples from attacking Roman territorial holdings. A later wall, the Antonine Wall, is also going to be built. The Antonine Wall is not nearly as impressive, though, as Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall is made of stone. It's definitely a significant obstacle. The Antonine Wall is not nearly as impressive. And this map shows the phases of Roman territorial expansion. This area in light green is going to be primarily brought into the empire by Trajan. But you can see that the Roman Empire extends across the Mediterranean, territorial holdings across North Africa, across the Middle East, across the Mediterranean portions of Europe, and even north beyond the Mediterranean into northern Gaul and the Alps, and into Britannia, of course. So a large empire that allows for a population that can be mobilized for warfare, tax base, but also it's hard to defend this territory. Keeping your troops supplied on the frontier is challenging, and then making new conquests when you already have a large empire is going to be more of a challenge. So there's going to be some problems as a result of this. The Pax Romana is going to come to an end as the Romans are just having a much more difficult time conquering territory, but also hanging on to the territories they already own. And that's going to lead to the crisis of the 200s, and I would argue at the end of the day, the fall of the Roman Empire, or at least the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now I want to talk about the Severan dynasty. And the Severan dynasty, it will contribute in many ways to the crisis of the 200s. It happens from 235 to 284 CE. By the time the Severan dynasty comes to power, the Pax Romana is over. The empire is facing more problems, but arguably the Severan rulers make things even worse. And things were not off to that bad of a start. Septimus Severus, this is Septimus Severus here. This is a gold bust of Emperor Septimus Severus. He wanted to return the Roman Empire to going out on more campaigns of conquest. He recognized that conquest was important. It was an important part of Roman national imperial security, and it was an important part of the Roman economy. And he planned on having a campaign in Caledonia or Scotland, but he dies before that campaign can take place. His final wishes were that his sons, Caracalla, seen here, and his other son Geta, that they would pay the soldiers well, treat the soldiers well, and then rule together peacefully as co-emperors. And they don't uphold their father's dying wish, or at least Caracalla doesn't, because Caracalla will have his brother Geta killed, and he will become the sole Roman emperor. So he's killing his own brother to have power. And Caracalla's father, Septimus Severus, had debased the currency in order to pay for the soldiers, in order to pay their wages. And debasement of currency had happened before in Roman history. Emperor Nero had debased the currency. Emperor Trajan had debased the currency. But Emperor Septimus Severus will debase the currency by about 15%. And that very quick debasement is going to really damage the Roman economy. And it will lead to inflation. And it will be particularly bad, actually, for the Roman soldiers that it was supposed to help. The Roman soldiers will find, well, now everything costs more money because the currency has been debased. There's more currency out there. They need a raise. And so what will happen is Caracalla will give the Roman soldiers a raise, which is a good thing, but that's only going to increase the Roman government's spending. And Caracalla is spending very liberally on other things, on other projects. And in his personal life, Caracalla is not a sober and judicious man. He's not following the Augustus Caesar ideal. He is obsessed with the image of Alexander the Great. It was said that Caracalla even wore a blonde wig to try to make himself look like Alexander the Great, because Alexander had light hair. And by the way, Caracalla, that's not his real name. He was called Caracalla because of a Gaulish-style cloak he wore, a cloak that you would wear, in the northern parts of the Roman territory in Gaul. And even though Caracalla was trying to buy the support of the Roman military, ironically, he's going to be killed by a Roman soldier. A disgruntled Roman soldier who had been denied a promotion will kill Caracalla. So Septimus Severus is not a terrible emperor, but his choice to debase the currency is going to cause economic problems for the empire. And then not creating a good succession plan leads to his two sons fighting each other, of which Caracalla is the winner. Caracalla will give Roman soldiers a raise, but that's going to mean more spending is going to be necessary on the part of the Roman government to pay those raises. And it's not really enough to even keep Caracalla from being killed by one of his own troops. Caracalla does have a positive accomplishment, though, and it's known as the Edict of Caracalla. And this was a law that made all free males born in the empire citizens. And the Edict of Caracalla, it reversed older Roman policies where only some people born in the Roman Empire could become citizens. It depended on which part of the empire you lived in, whether or not you would be a citizen. Now, if you're born within the bounds of the Roman Empire and you're a free person, you're not a slave, you will be a citizen. And of course, women are considered to be citizens as well, but they don't have the full rights of citizens. They don't get to vote the way men do. So not everything about Caracalla is bad. We'll talk about why Caracalla passed this very forward-thinking piece of legislation, though, in our next video. It was not for wholly altruistic reasons, as you'll see. On the whole, though, policies of the Severans, Septimus Severus, Caracalla, and then another emperor named Elagabalus are really going to damage the Roman Empire. Overspending, debasement of currency, disgruntlement of the Roman legions at the increased cost of living, violence between leaders, and then transgression of Roman cultural norms. Caracalla's obsession with Alexander the Great. Some of the things that Elagabalus will do, this is going to ultimately undermine the office of the Roman Empire, undermine the Principate, undermine the Princeps, and it's going to contribute to the crisis of the 200s. The final thing we'll talk about in this video is Emperor Elagabalus and his reign as emperor. Elagabalus lived from 204 to 222 CE, and he reigned from 218 to 222 CE. So Elagabalus becomes emperor when he's 14 years old, and his reign ends when he's 18 years old. Elagabalus was not his real name. His real name was Sextus Varius Avitus Bassianus. The name Elagabalus is a reference to his religious beliefs. Elagabalus was a worshiper of the Arab god Elagabal, also known as Baal, and Elagabalus was of Arab descent. More and more emperors over time are going to be from outside of Italia, and he will try to replace Jupiter, the king of the Greco-Roman pantheon of gods, with Elagabal. And this is going to anger Romans of all classes who feel that their religion is being threatened by this young emperor. And in his personal life, he really liked to party, he liked to have a good time, and these parties are very expensive. This is a time when the Roman Empire is experiencing a lot of financial problems because of inflation, debasement of currency. It's not a good look for Elagabalus to be having these extravagant, decadent parties. To make matters worse, Elagabalus will have relationships with multiple women and with men. One of the relationships with women that he will have will be with a Vestal virgin, and Vestal virgins were not supposed to have sexual relations. For a Vestal virgin to have sexual relations could bring blight and pestilence onto the Roman people. It could lead to divine judgment for the Roman people if their vows are not upheld. And he had sexual relationships with men as well, and it was not something that Roman men could not do. Roman men could have sexual relations with other men, but it had to take place in certain ways. There were a lot of rules regarding same-sex relationships between men in ancient Rome. And Elagabalus will transgress those rules. He will have a relationship with a charioteer and a slave named Hierocles. And in this relationship, Elagabalus will not be the dominant one, the man in the relationship in Roman terms. He will be, Hierocles will be the man in this relationship. And Elagabalus will even want to have Hierocles referred to as Caesar, and he'll want himself to be referred to as empress. So Elagabalus will want himself or herself to be referred to as an empress in female terms. And it's possible that Elagabalus was transgender, that he saw himself as a woman, or she saw herself as a woman. There's evidence that Elagabalus may have even sought what used to be called a sex change operation. Now it's generally called gender affirmation surgery. But there's controversy here. The main source we have for Elagabalus's life is Cassius Dio, a upper-class Roman historian who would have been very biased against Elagabalus and may have fabricated these stories, made up these stories to make Elagabalus sound as decadent as possible, to make him sound like someone who was really transgressing Roman social norms. And Elagabalus, regarding himself or herself as a woman, that would have really transgressed Roman social norms and Roman gender norms. Roman emperors are supposed to be male. Roman society is very patriarchal. Men, if they're going to be in relationships with other men, you want to be the dominant one. You don't want to be the subordinate one in that relationship. And Elagabalus, according to Cassius Dio, didn't care about those social norms, those gender norms in his life. He wanted to live, or she wanted to live, very differently, and that was one of the reasons why upper-class Romans did not like Elagabalus, along with the fact that Elagabalus wanted to change the religion of the empire as well. So upper-class Romans, including Elagabalus's own grandmother, Julia, will conspire to have Elagabalus assassinated. And that's exactly what will happen. The Praetorian Guard will kill Elagabalus. They will drag Elagabalus's body through Rome and throw it in the Tiber River. And all of this happened to Elagabalus during his or her youth. And I want to point out that although Elagabalus is considered to be a bad emperor, this is not because Elagabalus was transgender in our modern opinions. Elagabalus was considered to be a bad emperor for not following the social norms of Rome, which upset Romans, and for not following the religious norms of Rome, which upset the Roman people. I'm not making a moral judgment about Elagabalus's personal life, Elagabalus's gender identity. I'm talking about how Romans would have understood Elagabalus based on the Cassius Dio source that we have. But after Elagabalus's death, Elagabalus's friends and lovers, including Heracles, are going to be killed as well. Basically, they're trying to wipe away any memory of Elagabalus. And Elagabalus's cousin, Severus Alexander, is going to become the next, is going to replace Elagabalus, and he will rule from 222 to 235, and Severus Alexander will actually be assassinated as well. And Severus Alexander's assassination will be the official beginning of the crisis of the 200s, which goes from 235 to 284 CE. Conclusion. The Roman civilization during the Pax Romana experienced relative peace and prosperity and economic and social and cultural growth and flourishment. The Pax Romana lasts for about 200 years, from the reign of Augustus Caesar to about the time of the reign of Commodus. It sort of ends during Commodus's reign. And during this period, the empire generally is militarily secure. There are some exceptions, like the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, but there are some pretty significant territorial gains during this period. The Roman conquest of Britannia under Emperor Claudius, and then the conquest that the Emperor Trajan makes, both in the Middle East and in the Danube River Valley. During this period, there's a series of good emperors and bad emperors, but there's more good emperors than bad emperors, and the policies of the good emperors are able to overwhelm and not cancel out, but keep the policies of the bad emperors from destroying the empire. And good emperors, they will model themselves after Augustus Caesar. They will focus on being good first citizens. They will live well, but they will not live too extravagantly, and they will make patronage and virtue, being good patrons to the clients that are the Roman people, they will make that their priority. Bad emperors will be much more selfish, focused on themselves. They will violate Roman standards of morality, Roman standards of virtue, and they will not pattern themselves after Augustus. People like Nero, Commodus do not pattern themselves after Augustus Caesar.
But there are beginning to be too many bad emperors. The policies of the bad emperors are overwhelming the policies of the good emperors, and the Pax Romana comes to an end with Commodus's reign, and then it gets worse during the Severan dynasty. The Severans wanted to make Rome more militarily powerful, but they did this by weakening the economy through the debasement of currency, and then they introduce a lot more violence into Roman politics because Caracalla has his brother killed. That way he can be sole Roman emperor. And these financial problems, trying to pay for a large military, and then violence between people who want to rule Rome, that's going to set things up for the crisis of the 200s, in which Roman generals will fight each other, and there'll be civil wars, and they will pronounce themselves emperor, and then they'll be killed by the person who becomes the next emperor. So some of these things, they happen because of bad policies. Policies by the Severan dynasty, policies by Nero, who also did things like debasing currency and spending in an outrageous manner. There were bad policies at work here, but then there's also just long-term issues. The Roman Empire is based on conquest, based on bringing in spoils of war to fund the empire. And as conquests become more difficult, or as there's a diminishing return on these conquests, the Roman Empire either needs to adapt and develop a new economic system, or it's going to go into decline. And what you see happens is the Roman Empire will begin to decline, and you're really going to see that in the crisis of the 200s, which we'll talk about in a future video. In our next video, though, we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about Roman life, everyday Roman life during the Pax Romana.